Hello everyone, and welcome to Fictional Vortex. So we are back with an interesting series on what if Naruto was a blue-eyed vampire. But before we start, I just want to remind you to please subscribe to my channel and hit the like button if you enjoy my content. Let's start the story. The morning was like all others that had come before it. Well, it was not morning for humans as the orange moderately warm sun had began to set, but it was morning for Lance and therefore time to wake up the king. It wasn't that they, the blue-eyed vampire clan, could not live under the sun. Their fair skin was highly tolerant of it. It was their eyes that suffered under the sun, sensitive as it was. The light rays were incredibly piercing. Lance gave the king another 10 minutes of sleep, knowing all too well how the king liked to complain that they never let him sleep in. Lance smiled. Naruto was such a spoiled king. The type that would surely appall the human race. After 10 minutes flew by and it seems guests had began to arrive, their voices echoing through the wide halls of Akatsuki Castle. Lance pushed away from the wall he had been leaning on and approached the double-sided door that almost touched the roof. "Your Majesty," said Lance as he knocked once then twice on the door, "I'm coming in." No sound came through the door and Lance, with his hand on the hilt of his sword, opened the door. He stepped into the dark room, but his eyes saw as though it was daytime. He approached the window, avoiding the toys scattered around on the floor. Why His Majesty enjoyed playing with them Lance did not understand. There were many of them thrown haphazardly around for anyone to trip on. The king seemed to value them highly. Lance would not be the one to destroy any of them. Safely maneuvering his way to the window without stepping on anything, which wasn't difficult having gotten used to it, Lance lifted up the drapes and the bright moonlight shone into the room, settling on gold hair, turned silver by the light. Naruto let out a groan and sat up, blinking his wide blue eyes and rubbing at them to drive out sleep. How adorable, thought Lance with a smile. "Good morning, Your Majesty," said Lance, a hand to his chest as all knights greeted their superiors. Of course the king was the only one he ever showed this to. "Lance, why are you here? Did you stand guard in front of my door again?" Lance did not confirm the king's assumptions. It was usual for him to ask questions like this. "Your Majesty, the guests are arriving. You should get ready now," he said. The king eyed him for a moment and sighed. "I have told you before, Lance, it's not your duty to guard me. There are negatives for that. You should be at home with your wife. Do you want her to hate me more and say that I am stealing you away?" Lance only smiled. "No one can hate you, my king," he said, "and you had me long before she was born. She can't complain knowing how I have sworn my life to you." The king seemed to enjoy reminding Lance about his wife and children, even though he knew fully well that Lance would never leave him for them. Maybe he was worried about betrayal or being abandoned. Lance could never hope to understand Naruto's reasoning, how he could think there was anyone who would ever abandon or betray him. Naruto was well loved and the people, including the human population that live in Elfheim, adored him. That is why they were all gathered today to celebrate with him. Silence from Naruto caused Lance to start. "Your Majesty, we must get you ready for the party. You don't want to keep your guest waiting." "Ah," the king groaned, his eyes falling close for a moment. He sighed and opened his eyes to stare at Lance, who frowned. "Remind me again why we are having this stupid party." "Your Majesty," Lance admonished, "this is a celebration on your honor. Everyone is taking it very seriously." Yes, grumbled the king as he started to push aside red blankets embroidered with gold thread. Lance quickly got his royal slippers from under the bed and positioned them on the mini stair in front of the bed. Naruto looked down at him for a silent moment before allowing Lance to grab his small pale feet and slip on his slippers. "Thank you, Lance. Now you can get Joanne. She will get me dressed." He climbed down the stairs and stood, a very impressive height for his body that was not much older from a 12-year-old human. His blonde hair was pressed from sleeping, but his blue eyes were as brilliant as always. Lance knelt, smiled up at his king. "Happy birthday, Your Majesty," he said. The king smiled broadly. "Thank you. I'll never get used to being known as 500 years old," he laughed. "And of course, you are much older." Naruto nodded. "But this is good for the people since I can't really remember my birthday. It's good to have a birthday. I'm going to get lots of gift." Smiling broadly, the king gestured at Lance. "Go on, I want to get dressed." Seeing Naruto in high spirits allowed Lance to feel relieved, like a weight dropping off his shoulder. Naruto always looked like he didn't enjoy much these days, always locking himself in his room without a word to anyone. It seemed the only thing he enjoyed was playing with these toys. This party should do him some good, give him a chance to socialize and have fun with living people. Always being inside Akatsuki Castle, never going out or meeting new people, was surely what was wrong with Naruto. It's not as though Naruto was not allowed to leave the castle, but it wasn't proper for him to be seen too frequently. Lance and the others decided the king needed to be revered as a god, which he was now. He was. Lance smiled. Yes, I will get Joanne for you. He exited His Majesty's room and saw the young negative with her fellow retinue standing outside. They bowed their heads, never meeting his eyes as always. You may go in, he told them. Be quick. Yes, Your Excellency, Joanne replied, and with their heads lowered, the group of men and women followed behind her into the room. They would arrange the king's room, even though he always wanted things to be left as it is in there, but they can't. The room has not been cleaned for 3 days on the king's orders, from what Lance had seen, anymore, and they would be in trouble. Lance leaned on the wall again and waited. He never hated waiting, he has been doing it all his life for Naruto, for his king. He'd wait forever if Naruto wished it. Dressed richly in white shirt with frilly sleeves, red shorts and a kingly red cape embroidered with red and silver threads, and embellished in beads, Naruto stepped out of his room. He found Lance standing outside his door as he had expected, his eyes close, silver hair falling over one eye. Standing like that, he looked like a hero from one of those adventure novels Sasori sent him. Good looks and good sense of loyalty, Lance was certainly the ideal knight. His blue eyes opened and Naruto smiled at him. You were waiting for me again, he said. Of course, I want to accompany you to the party, Your Majesty, Lance replied, standing now with one hand on his sword. Naruto nodded. It was the reply he had expected. When would Lance learn that Naruto didn't need him to wait around for him? He was a general in his own right now, he had other responsibilities, he should be able to leave the taking care of Naruto to someone else. Naruto inwardly sighed. Even though he told Lance practically every time that he didn't need to be catered for and watched so closely, the stubborn man refused to stop. Thanks, said Naruto. Has the party started already? He asked as he fell into step with Lance walking closely but a little behind him. Yes, the guests are all here and they are excited to see Your Majesty, Lance replied with a pleased smile. Naruto smiled back, a false smile that he had practiced in the mirror to look genuine enough to fool even Lance. The man watched him too closely for signs of unhappiness, which made him even more determined to be around Naruto. It's not that Naruto didn't want him around, no, he valued Lance highly, that is why he wanted the man to have a life outside of him. Naruto couldn't have that. The life of a king, even though one that was practically just a figurehead at this point, was too demanding. A lot of people were counting on him to keep the blue-eyed vampire clan alive. He couldn't disappoint them, and unfortunately for him that meant he had to make certain sacrifices, such as abandoning his desire to travel the world and try new things. Creating the blue-eyed vampire clan wasn't meant to take all that away, but the more famous they became, the bigger their world got. People, vampires alike, came to them and suddenly he was king to an entire city. As king he couldn't leave and do whatever he wanted. It was hard to find happiness in what has become like a prison to him. The sound of music grew closer as they climbed down spiraled stairs with polished wood railings. Akatsuki Castle was beautiful, built almost 300 years ago from scratch. The arched hallways were wide and went on for way too long. Naruto always hated having to walk it, especially with the weight of his jeweled crown cresting his head. This was his birthday and he needed to look happy, overjoyed that his people were once again there to celebrate with him, but why did he feel as if a dark shadow was on his back? A hollow feeling in his chest, like something was missing, made it so much harder for him to even put on the act that was expected of him. This feeling was not new, it had been going on for some time now, growing worse each day. Naruto couldn't pinpoint exactly why he felt so bad most of the day, spending it alone playing with his toys or sleeping at odd times in the afternoon. Either way, the thought of going to this birthday party his people had organized for him wasn't filling him with joy. Your Majesty? Naruto blinked and looked sideways at the pale handsome face of Lance, who was staring at him with a worried frown. Huh? Had he been lost in thought for too long? What is it, Lance? He asked, putting on a smile, his eyes slanting close. Is something wrong, Your Majesty? He asked. Naruto laughed. Nope, I'm good. Why? You worry too much, Lance. No wonder your wife is always complaining that you are ruining your good looks. A puzzled but not distracted look set on Lance's face. Your Majesty, when did she complain to you? Naruto shook his head. Forget it, doesn't matter. We're here now. He looked at the negatives standing by the closed double-sided door and they moved to open the doors. At once the music from inside got louder and the brightness was almost too piercing. The trumpet sounded his arrival. Naruto smiled at Lance once before walking into the room. The music stopped, along with the chattering voices of people. All eyes stared towards him. In this room was only the full-bloods and some positives. The full-bloods identified by their blue eyes. Would be nice to see other eye colors, thought Naruto as he walked towards the stairs and red carpet that trailed to the throne. Seeing blue eyes every day was so boring. Still he smiled at his people and nodded at them. So many unfamiliar faces stared at him, some with smiles, others with smug looks of respect and smirks of pride. Naruto guessed. Were this really his people? He didn't know a thing about them, barely knew any names. Keeping his smiling, pleased expression, Naruto made it to the throne seat. Left and right of it were 5 and 4 lower but gold-made seats meant for the 9s. Only one of them was seated there, and she stood now giving Naruto a formal bow. Nishiki. Naruto returned the nod and turned to face the crowd of blue-eyed guests, dressed richly in fine clothes that glittered and shimmered. You can continue, he waved and movement started again. The images of beautiful faces started moving and producing words. Music blared from the speakers and all was once again as it was. Naruto sighed and almost flopped into his seat if not for Lance, who arrived and pushed the royal stool under his legs. Apparently it was unbecoming for a king's leg to dangle from his throne. Naruto smiled at him when he looked up. He smiled back as always and took position to Naruto's right, standing. Naruto had long given up on him ever seating down along with the other 9s. Where were they anyway? No matter how much he searched, Naruto could not find any one of them besides Lance and Nishiki. Did they decide not to attend the party? Oh, that would be nice. Just as Naruto started to feel a glow, another trumpet sounded. He scoffed as their names were announced. His Excellency, Nagato, His Excellency Yahiko, Her Excellency, Yoko, Her Excellency, Konan arrive, cried the announcer. A young bald negative. They filed in looking all high and mighty. Words of adoration poured out from the lips of the audience, who obviously thought they were very cool. Were they really? Naruto's lips curled. When did he make such arrogant people? The 9s walked in a straight line led by Nagato. The violet-haired man had eyes covered by a pair of glasses trained solely on Naruto, effectively ignoring his admirers who tried to get him to look at them even once. What does he want now? Lance laughed. Your Majesty, Nagato is very displeased with you because of how you have shirked most of your duty to him, Lance said. Naruto buried into the seat. He is not going to give me grief about that right now, is he? That four-eyed jerk, he should just let it go already, jeez. Lance chuckled. Naruto would have glared at him because he was really serious, but now the 4 had neared him. Your Majesty, they chorused and bowed in almost perfect sync, all led by Nagato. He was more of a king than Naruto felt. Yahiko, Konan, Nagato, and Yoko, you all look well, said Naruto with a nervous smile. We'd be so much better if, Your Majesty, did not leave his job to others, said Nagato without a single trace of smile on his hard but handsome face. Naruto pursed his lips at him, thinking, geez, this guy really just came here to give him grief, didn't he? Konan opened her purple-painted lips. Yes, Your Majesty, and so do you. She was always so gracious. Happy birthday, Your Majesty. And was always so lackluster, but Naruto knew deep down she meant well, and even though she said that looking glum and without a smile, she was truly happy. Naruto stared at her. Yoko, he'd play nice for now and not move, but if she tried anything, she grabbed his face. Your Majesty, 500 years old and you haven't aged a bit. You are really the best specimen of a man, truly beautiful. And those eyes are just so. Calm down, Yoko. Why do you always treat His Majesty like your own personal toy? Are you still planning to sell his body parts? This was Nagato. The man was mean-spirited, but he just saved Naruto from being molested by Yoko, his hand holding her back by the hem of her kimono. Naruto smiled at him gratefully. No way, I'm not going to sell it. Just keep it in my best collection, Yoko pouted. A really cute sight apparently, because her admirers started to sigh and make swooning eyes. Geez. If they only knew she was a freak obsessed with human body. Ah, Yoko. How are you? Naruto asked to change the subject of body parts and weird collections. Ah, your majesty cares so much about me. Are you sure you are not in love with me? Her blue eyes shone. Perhaps now you want to be my husband. No, I'm pretty sure that I don't want to be your 28th husband, said Naruto, getting tired of her always proposing to him. She always did this, every single time. That's right, don't upset his majesty, Yoko-sama, a chuckling voice said, and the crowd parted to reveal a pink-haired beauty, looking 16, but she was also a 9 and she had more fans than even Yoko, with voices and eyes turned to her. Sakura. Naruto leaned forward with a smile and laugh. You came. It was no secret that Naruto favored the young vampire, the newest member of the Nines. He'd turned her barely 10 years ago. Of course I did, Sakura said and waved to the crowd. How are you, your majesty? She smiled. Just call me Naruto, I told you already. Naruto-sama, happy birthday, she obliged and bowed. Naruto shook his head, deciding then not to reprimand her for her excessive formality. Maybe she had to in front of their guest. All their eyes were on them. It wasn't every day that the Nines and the king were in one place. They all had their duties. You should really consider marriage though, Sakura continued. Why are you bringing that up? There is no point for a man who can't have children to marry. Naruto said, frowning a bit. It's not like he didn't want to get married, he just didn't see the point when he couldn't impregnate a woman. His son had also carried that curse too, didn't he? I see Sasori is not here today, said Yahiko as if catching Naruto's thought. Oh yes, he is your favorite, but he never comes to your birthday party. It's already been 4 years since he left Akatsuki Castle, Yoko said. He won't come because I told him not to, said Naruto. Sasori was off having adventures, it was Naruto's wish. There was no reason for the two of them to stay in Akatsuki Castle. And from the toys and tales Sasori sent him, Naruto felt like he was also there having the adventure with him. Yahiko didn't look very interested. In that case I'm going to mingle a bit. The Nines took their seats, but 2 spaces were open. Naruto wondered about Deidara, another 9 that hung around Akatsuki Castle. Lance, where is Deidara? He is on the mission, your majesty. Mission. Naruto remembered. Oh yes, mission. Every 3 years Naruto gave the vampires permission to hunt humans. They needed blood, there is nothing they could do about it, but those days always left him feeling a deep sadness. If only the blue-eyed vampires were not vampires. Deidara. The announcer was cut short and the door opened. Immediately the smell of blood, strong and pungent, swept in. All the vampires in the room turned rigid with attention, drawn to the blood. Your Majesty, Deidara bowed and grinned, the mission was successful. Naruto couldn't smile back, he never could after the hunting. Then, everyone, he raised his voice, enjoy the refreshments. His lips pulled tight together and he almost didn't get the words out. He shouldn't show his sadness to them, but then again they weren't looking. Naruto lowered his eyes and heard words of gratitude as the people filed out of the room. Naruto knew where they were going, a room inside Akatsuki Castle, big enough to hold many people, also called the Akatsuki feeding room. Lance remained at his side. Naruto almost didn't have the strength to say anything to him or even hide how he was feeling. Young as she was, Sakura was a slave to vampire hunger, so she wasn't there, and Lance, even though he saw how sad Naruto was, couldn't know, let alone understand why Naruto was sad. 10 years ago, maybe Naruto would have been the first to get there, been the first to drink human blood. But 10 years ago he had thought humans were deceitful animals, not worthy of anything else but to be hunted and eaten. That's why the hunting rule exists. But after that day 10 years ago, Naruto made a new rule that the only time his people would hunt humans was after 3 years, and only then. That day he had met a human that changed everything. Lance, join them, said Naruto without raising his head. No, I will stay with you, Lance replied, as Naruto had expected and hoped. But he couldn't force Lance because of his persistent sense of duty to abandon the part of him that was a vampire just to please himself. Just go, Naruto snapped. He didn't need Lance at his side right now, it's an order. The man's entire being seemed to vibrate his refusal and desire not to go, but in the end, his sense of duty won and he looked once for a long moment at Naruto before exiting the ballroom. Naruto sighed and looked toward the grand room, gold-painted walls, alight with the bright glowing lights of the chandeliers. Gifts piled before the tall, delicious-looking cake. He should open some. That was the only joy he ever got from these parties, but he felt no desire or strength to do it. So he called the royal guards and asked them to take him to his room. Maybe he should have gone alone, but the presence of negatives, so human-like, soothed him somehow. A loud sound blasted from the floor below them. Naruto's eyes went wide. What was going on? Akatsuki Castle was eternally quiet. The only time anything loud was heard was during parties, but from the sounds of swords and yells, some people were fighting, and it was coming closer. Naruto felt something shake him and his jaw twitched. Something was happening at last, something interesting was happening. He kept his eyes trained on the hallway, expecting and waiting. He needed to see. Your Majesty, seems like a fight has broken out below us. We should take you to your quarters. The urgency in the soldier's voice was very clear. He must have known that was no ordinary fight. There was an intruder. Who would dare though, especially today when all the nines were gathered in one place? Naruto felt like jumping and spinning around. A smile threatened to break out, but his guards would think he was insane if he just started smiling. They were already freaked out as it is. Naruto didn't want them hurt. Just go sound the alarm, said Naruto. I'll be fine on my own. We can't leave you, Your Majesty, the two men said so loudly as if the idea that they could was just so far out of their mind, and they wondered how he could think they could. Naruto didn't want them hurt, which was likely with an intruder in the castle. This was the first anyone had ever made it this far. Intruders come into the city looking to kill Naruto, but they never made it past the gates, and Naruto only learned about their existence at all by word of mouth. Someone appeared. He was fast as he knocked down two negatives guards, but Naruto could make out black hair and a red overall. The person stopped as if surprised to see him there, then he moved, faster than before, and the two negatives beside him were down. A pistol was pointed at him, straight in the eyes. Don't move, a voice deep and clear came from the man. So this is what a pistol looks like in real life. Wait, this was no ordinary pistol. Naruto could see a smoke line coming from it, almost as if it was hot, but it didn't burn the man. So this is a hunter's weapon, he said. He knew his excitement was obvious. He wanted to touch the object and feel if it really burned. Don't talk, the man frowned. And don't make any sudden movements. Without warning, he was being carried over the man's shoulder. The smell of the man was strangely sweet. Was it his blood or just his normal smell? It smelled like pine and nuts. Why are you going up? He asked as the man climbed the spiral stairs 3 at a time. Shut up. He dropped Naruto and took out a rope. He tied Naruto's hand and placed a gag in his mouth. They burned, the ropes. Another hunter's weapon. Naruto looked at it with shining eyes. So cool. The man lifted him again and was running. More guards appeared, but he shot them down. They were negatives. Weapons like that would only hurt them but not kill them. They were barely vampires. Naruto hoped no one was dead and that they got treated soon. If they were wounded severely, it would be troublesome. But so long as it is just a hunter's weapon, they shouldn't die. Their human half should protect them. Naruto could only hope. Getting to the window on the second floor, the man dropped him again. He took out some kind of paper and placed it on the glass. It exploded, a loud sound that left Naruto's sensitive ears ringing. He was stunned for a bit, but he felt himself being picked in a rush of air. Was he being kidnapped? Yes, he was, and that was amazing. It was the eve of Hunter's examination, and the boys' dormitory was in a state of unrest. One person in particular kept pacing endlessly and muttering sorrowfully. Itachi raised his head again to follow the figure of his roommate and friend as he paced to and fro within the short expanse of the room. The room was not large, merely 6 steps, and Juno got to the end. You are distracting me, Juno, said Itachi, and returned to writing on his book. He was seated on his chair and desk provided by the Hunters' Academy. Oh my god, Juno cried out. Itachi, seriously, how can you be studying right now? Seriously. Oh, shouldn't I? Itachi asked, but did not stop writing. His attention, saved from Juno's pacing, now focused on the task of jotting down words as he read the book Hunters: A History. Didn't you hear what they've been saying? They said we are going to be facing real vampires. Real vampires, man. I'm not ready for that, Juno complained. I thought that's what you've been training for the last 2 years in the Hunters' Academy. Yeah, but I didn't think I'd be facing vampires so soon. I mean, what if I can't handle it? You think those teachers would come and save me? I don't want to die. I still have my dreams to fulfill, you know. Itachi smiled slightly and turned the page of his book. I haven't heard of anyone dying in a hunter's exam, so you should be fine, he said. Juno heaved a sigh and leaned against the bunk bed. Yeah, me neither. You just got to consider the possibility, you know. I never really wanted to come here, you see. Itachi stayed his pen and raised his head. That was the first time he'd heard that from Juno. He just assumed that like everyone here he wanted the fame, prestige and money that came with being a hunter. I see, he said. Yeah, cause you know, I got 2 little brothers and everything. My ma got killed by one of them vamps and they only got me for a breadwinner, that's why I came here, Juno said. I'm sorry to hear that, Itachi said and did not lower his head to write again, expecting more revelations. He wondered if Juno would expect him to return the favor, and he really didn't think he could because unlike Juno's passionate reason for wanting to become a hunter, Itachi did not want to become one. Basically, if he told Juno that the man would probably think he was strange. Why wouldn't he want to become a hunter? There was so much to gain and aside from the risk of losing your life. However, those were not things Itachi wanted, hence he did not want to become a hunter, but he must. It was that simple. He was the son of the chief of Uchiha Hunter clan. It was his duty. You are all mysterious and don't want to tell me your own reason, so I'm not going to ask. Juno said. Besides, you got nothing to worry about. With your skills you are way past a rank red hunter anyway. Thanks, but you overestimate me, Itachi said. That night Itachi slept little. He stayed up thinking about meeting his family and also listening to Juno's restless sleep. The next day began and Juno, accompanied by Itachi, walked into the great hall usually used for meetings. Itachi saw his father standing among the hunter lead council, and after a brief eye contact between them he turned his attention to the busty principal giving a speech. She told them they would be paired into a group of 4 and that the failure of one meant the failure of all. She wanted no foul play and suggested that those who were scared should leave immediately, for they were not responsible for their lives on this mission. She also emphasized that the exam was for only those 18 and above, anyone younger should leave quickly. A few people left after the speech. The next person to give a speech was Itachi's father. He talked steadily with enviable confidence about weeding out deserters, that from there on out everyone in that hall were rank white hunters and when they passed it would simply become official. He reassured them that while they do try to save as much students as possible, they were short on teachers, so no one should count on being saved. Juno almost pissed himself and fidgeted endlessly. When all the formalities were over they were allowed to see their families. Itachi walked into a room with more luxury than he'd ever seen in all his 18 years of life, and before he got a chance to admire the array of design he was enveloped on the middle with 2 hugged by his 11-year-old brother. He should be turning 12 soon, Itachi thought. Itachi, you are going to be a hunter soon. That is so, boss, Sasuke said when he pulled back to look at him. Itachi smiled down at him. Sasuke, he said. From the corner of his eye he saw a figure move and raised his head to see his mother standing there. He had not expected her to come. She had been so sick these last few years, traveling had been impossible for her. Mother, he said in greeting, you didn't have to worry yourself. I reasoned that this might be the last time I see you, so I summoned the strength to be here. She walked towards him, her face haggard by illness. It is not going to be the last day, mother. Perhaps not, but I do not dare take that chance. She reached out a hand to cup his cheek. You've lost weight. Before he could protest he was seated down and eating his mother's delicious curry rice she had brought with her. Sasuke joined him on the couch. He has always been unable to resist their mother's curry rice. Itachi let him have as much as he wanted, and as he tasted the rich spicy flavor of the food, tears stung his eyes. It's been 2 years since he tasted this food and he felt suddenly nostalgic. All the years he'd spent here in Hunter's Academy he'd never missed home so much as he did now. I hear your father would be one of the examiners this year, is that so? Mother asked. She was seated on the second couch watching them eat. Yes. Do watch him, he tends to go overboard. Itachi smiled and looked away from her. I will try. He made sure to finish every last grain of rice with Sasuke's help, then he covered the dish and placed it in her bag. He felt more than heard his mother exhale, and he turned to see a wary expression on her face. I had hoped dearly that this day would not come. She began to speak with a low voice. Don't worry too much, mother, I will be fine. Itachi tried to reassure, but the expression refused leave of her face. Don't worry about mother, she is always saying things like that even at home. I believe in you, big brother, I know for sure that there is not a rank white hunter stronger than you in this building," Sasuke declared, dark eyes shining with a steady light. His innocence was endearing. Itachi had always found solace in his brother's presence. His everlasting faith in Itachi made him feel like he could take on anything. Itachi laughed. "How would you know?" "Because Dad taught you, and he is the strongest hunter in the world," Sasuke replied. "Oh. If there was someone else he believed in just as much as he did Itachi, it would be their father." "All right." He pulled Sasuke into a corner so their mother won't hear them and began to whisper. "Do you want to know the first weapon father ever used?" he asked Sasuke, his arm wrapped around the small shoulders. Sasuke's eyes became animated and shining. "What is it?" he asked conspiratorially. Itachi reached into his inner pocket within his coat and pulled out twin daggers. He handed them to Sasuke and watched as the boy worshipped the blade with his eyes. "They're yours now, you must take care of them." "I will. I promise," Sasuke declared. "What are you two muttering about over there?" their mother asked, peering over. "Nothing," they chorused. She folded her hands and continued watching them with a small smile playing on her lips. "Now listen, Sasuke, you must only use it as a last resort, understood?" Sasuke nodded eagerly. "Thanks, big brother," he said and hugged Itachi, who could not resist a smile and ruffled the dark locks underneath his chin. After that he hugged his mother and then again his brother before leaving to join the rest of the examinees. The next time he saw Juno was in front of the hunting ground created 10 years ago. It was both a prison for vampires and a training ground for hunters. According to the books he'd read on it, there were at least over 100 vampires in the place. He saw Juno's spiky red head before he saw the pale freckled face. Juno waved and jogged the few distance towards him. He panted a little. "Gosh, I'm so glad we are on the same team," he said. "I thought for sure we'd be separated." Itachi smiled, also relieved. He did not want to think about working with someone he knew nothing about. "Hey Juno, do you happen to know the last 2 members of our team?" he asked as they began to walk towards the giant gate that was the entryway into the hunting grounds. Juno shook his head. "I know their name though, Kisame, and the other one was a chick called Karen. I saw them once," he replied. Itachi nodded and said nothing in reply. It was only natural that he'd not heard of this people before. Every year there were at least 2,000 hunter examinees. It was impossible to know them all. They did not see their 2 teammates until they'd entered the gates following the signal of the bell. The exam simply involved walking to the other gates located within a 20-mile radius and with the danger of encountering vampires on the way. They were also given a time limit of 24 hours. The exam started at exactly 4 p.m. and within 2 hours it would be dark. All kinds of vampires would awaken once it's night time. The hunting grounds only contain normals. These are the race of vampires that only move at night, unlike the blue-eyed vampires. There was a belief or claim that there were actually some full-blood in the hunting grounds, but no one has proved that claim to be true. When they entered the gate followed by almost 300 groups, it was shut behind them all. The gate was about 1,000 feet high and made of concrete and steel. It was also guarded by rank red hunters, even though at that point Itachi could not see anyone that looked like a rank red hunter around the gate. The gate was opened by a lever located on a tower outside the hunting grounds. It was too far away from the gate to see, but there must be a rank red hunter there. They were identified by a red piece of cloth tapered to the front of their shirt. It was removable. Even after the gate closed completely and the examiner announced that the exam had started, Itachi and Juno did not meet their teammates. "What should we do now?" Juno asked. Itachi did not know why these people were taking their time to find them. It didn't help that he did not even know what they looked like. "It takes half a day to make it that distance on foot. If we stayed here and wait for them, we might never make it to the gate before time runs out, and if we don't wait for them and start on our own, we might get disqualified." Itachi stated their situation and thought about it. "Our only solution would be to look for them," he decided. "I hear you, but how are we supposed to look for them here?" Juno said, and Itachi looked around. The place was crowded by almost 500 people. It would be tough to find someone when they don't even know what they look like. "We will just try to find them. It's our only option," Itachi said. "Can you describe them to me, then we can both go different ways to look for them." "I don't know, I can try, I guess. My memory is kinda hazy, but I recall the guy had fish eyes and was really pale, like seriously all white. His hair is blue. Yeah, blue, and he is about this tall." He gestured with his hand just a little above Itachi's height. "And the girl wears glasses, really skinny chick." Oh yes, she's got really red hair. Long red hair. Itachi listened and nodded. Alright, we will go look for them, he said. I will go this way and you go that way. They both decided to meet back there after 30 minutes. As Itachi searched for the two people, he noticed the numbers of examinees getting smaller. It was a good thing and a bad thing. If their teammates were among the people leaving, it would make their job to find them harder, but if they were not, they could easily be found when everyone else had left. He spotted a red head and saw Juno strolling towards him whilst looking around. When their eyes met, Juno hurried to his side and began to whisper. Itachi, I just heard someone say they know a shortcut to the gate. Everyone is going, he said. Itachi looked around again and noticed the numbers had gotten fewer still. He'd not heard of a shortcut in the hunting grounds. We still have to find our teammates first, he told Juno. Oh yeah. Juno turned his head here and there looking. Hey you two. What the hell are you doing? Someone yelled and Itachi turned to see the person they were looking for. He had thought Juno was exaggerating, but the boy did have fish eyes, his pupils were tiny and he was really pale. Looking for you, that's what. Juno replied with a nasty tone. Where have you been? Looking for you too. Now because of you lazy bums everyone has gone to find the shortcut whilst we are running out of time, Kisame said. It's no use arguing about it. We are all here now, let's just go, Itachi said. He had seen the red-haired girl coming their way. She stopped before them and frowned as if she'd seen something disgusting. I believe we all know each other's names, so I think it's best we skip the formalities. I know you two are Uchiha and all, but I won't stand for any one of you slowing me down, Kisame retorted with mean grin, obviously looking for trouble. Why you? Itachi stopped Juno before he'd say anything else and nodded. We won't slow you down, he said simply. Karen stared at him for a moment, nodded and pushed her glasses up her nose. Very well then, let's begin. We've already lost 40 minutes, she said. The shortcut is that away. Kisame pointed at a forked road a few distance to their left. Karen coughed. Ahem, we won't be taking that road, she said. Says who? Kisame said, swinging around to glare at her. Says me. I am from the Tsukiheim hunter clan. Sensing vampires is my forte, she said with a haughty air, nose thrust upwards. Huh? Kisame did not seem to care. I also think we shouldn't take that road, it's too convenient, Itachi added. Juno blinked at him but did not argue. Itachi was thankful for that. Kisame scoffed and took 2 steps to walk into Itachi's space, bringing his face closer so Itachi could make out scaly skin and smell garlic from him, but he did not flinch and met Kisame's eyes. So you think 'cause you are the son of Fugaku you get to call the shots around here? Itachi heard Juno choke beside him but did turn to take a gander at him. No, I just simply stated my opinion. I think we all have the right to do that, Itachi said. Kisame scoffed again. Well, I say this team needs a leader and I'm the only one fit enough for the role, he said. I do not know if you are fit for the role, but we are not taking that shortcut. There are a lot of vampires there, I can sense them. If we go there it would be suicide. Karen interjected. So instead of fighting and wasting time, why don't we just take another road? Kisame looked like he didn't plan on giving up, but then he heaved a sigh. What a bunch of wuss, he muttered. Fine, let's take another road, but no more telling me what to do, he said. Guys, is it just me or is the forest moving closer? Juno said, and Itachi turned to see that the forest did look like it was moving closer as the day started to shadow and the sun moved to the west. It's just an illusion, Karen said and started to march into the forest, going directly ahead. Itachi glanced at Juno and wondered if he should say anything. He had not meant to keep the fact that he was the son of the Uchiha clan chief from him, it had just never seemed important. Juno smiled at him as if to reassure him that he didn't mind, but they never talked about the issue. When they entered the forest it had gotten so dark Juno had turned on the lamps. It was a sure signal to get vampires after them, but since they could barely see in front of them it could not be helped. Karen had tried to strike up a conversation with Itachi for some reason he couldn't fathom, and he couldn't really keep up with her, but he tried to sound as amicable as possible, listening and injecting a few statements where necessary. It's coming. She suddenly gasped and gripped his arm. She did that the last time too, as though she was scared. Itachi spared her a glance and then turned his gaze to trees around them. He could see nothing and hear nothing aside from the crickets and insects. Kisame let out a loud sigh after 2 minutes passed and nothing happened. Are you sure you are from the Tsukiheim clan? You've been giving us a lot of wrong calls for the past 2 hours. I'm starting to doubt you have any sensing ability, he said. Itachi wasn't sure what to believe. It had indeed been 5 wrong calls so far and yet no vampire attacked them. He got the feeling Kisame was begging for some vampire to attack them just so he could use the huge sword hanging from his back. I felt it okay. It's like it's tailing us and getting closer every time, she said with a set mouth. Perhaps it is, we can only give it time, Itachi said. Or draw it out, Kisame retorted and drew out a dagger from his coat which he used to terrify Juno until the boy jumped to hide behind Itachi. Kisame laughed like a shark and used the dagger to cut a line on his arm. Here kitty, come and get it, fresh juicy blood, he called. Silence lasted for no less than a minute, then Itachi felt something fly past. It was human-like except it looked very malnourished with its ribs poking out from under his skin. Its legs long and spidery lunged from a tree and after Kisame. Itachi freed himself from Karen's grip and drew his sword, the weapon long and curved. He ran fast and reached in front of Kisame to slash the vampire on the chest, but sensing danger the leaping vampire changed its course, but it was too slow. Itachi's sword went into its skin and cut a long gash on its chest. Blood sprayed the air and the vampire, bleeding and groaning, disappeared in a run. Damn you! That was my kill, Kisame shouted at Itachi, then took off after the vampire. Don't go off on your own, Juno called, but there was no stopping him. Karen hurried to Itachi's side as he started to sheath his sword. That was so cool, I almost couldn't follow you with my eyes. You are exactly as I imagined, she smiled. I mean, when I heard you were the son of Fugaku, she chuckled nervously. Trust the son of Fugaku to be pretty amazing, right? She is right, man. I couldn't even react at all. I froze, Juno said. It was nothing, Itachi said and looked at the distance where Kisame disappeared off to. We should move on. I'm sure he would come to find us, he said. The others agreed with him and they started off again. Kisame met them almost an hour later, grinning like he'd just had a large piece of cake. He was in a better mood after that and the journey went smoothly. They passed the gates and found only 5 people waiting. 30 more came to join them and it altogether became 35. Itachi took pleasure in realizing that a lot of them were from the Uchiha clan. He was greeted by some he barely knew and they fawned over him. When all the other examinees were brought together with Itachi's group, it was at least 300 people that graduated out of 2,000. Their examiners said it was a bigger haul than they usually get. 170 of them were from Uchiha clan. Itachi said goodbye to Kisame and Karen after they received their white badge. Kisame expressed a desire to test his skills with Itachi at a different time and place before leaving, whereas Karen took the opportunity to kiss his cheek before she took off on her horse like something was on her tail. Juno chuckled and said, I just knew she liked you. Itachi sighed and grabbed the reins of his own horse and stirred it away. His father had said they would be traveling home together, but Itachi had not expected to see the rest of the graduates there too. They congratulated him as if they had not also passed the exam themselves. Itachi nodded and returned the sentiment all the same. Your mother can stop worrying now once you get home, Fugaku said as Itachi got on his horse. He turned and saw the majestic figure of his father on his black steed. So would I, Itachi replied. You should look a lot happier, his father said and kicked the flank of his steed forward. Itachi looked at his hand on the reins and wondered about what his father said. He didn't feel happy, so he couldn't force the expression on his face, but people would expect him to be. There was no reason he shouldn't be. Itachi exhaled and stirred his horse forward in gallop. They rode for 2 days and entered the border of Light City. It was daytime and the band had reduced their pace once they got nearer the Uchiha village. Some of them talked, others were falling asleep on their horses whilst others remained alert. Juno saw the smoke first and pointed it out to Itachi. It kinda looks like it's coming out of the village, he said. Someone else also pointed out how large it was and soon the band started to fret. What's going on? Some said. It looks like the village is on fire. Someone shrieked. Itachi swung around and saw Juno with tears gathering his eyes. Juno? He followed the direction of his friend's eyes and under the hill he saw horses riding hard, pulling cages with them. Blue eyes. They all had blue eyes. Blue-eyed vampires. Someone yelled before Itachi could think it. Oh God, no. They're coming from the village. What are we going to do? The whole band erupted in unrest and Itachi could only watch. He knew the implications of the vampires attacking Uchiha village. They did this every 3 years and this was the first time they came this far from Elfheim. His hand shook on the reins but he didn't dare do anything. His eyes followed the cages where he saw their people crying and yelling. "We've got to do something," Juno cried. "My brothers are in there." "Silence!" Fugaku yelled. "Now listen up all of you. I know you've all just graduated but this is a chance to prove that you earned your hunter's badge, so instead of whining like a bunch of sissies, why don't we all go show those damned blue-eyed vamps why they should never ever mess with our clan?" That earned a cry of battle and then everyone was drawing their swords, guns, arrows and whatever hunter weapons they used. Their horses galloped down the hills and the blue-eyed vampires never saw it coming. Itachi followed closely with his father. He had not yet seen if Sasuke or their mother was in one of the cages and that distracted him, which almost cost him an arm. "Don't get distracted, boy," his father yelled at him and skewered a vampire with his spear. "Look your enemy in the eye while you kill them." It was just like that time they trained together. Itachi cleared everything from his mind. Sasuke and their mother were safe at home. "They're unhurt," he told himself mentally. This was just another training, another exam. He closed his eyes briefly, letting go of his half-panic with a sigh. When he opened his eyes now he could see his enemy before him. They were faster than the normals he'd met on the hunting grounds but he could see them. That was important. The fight began. Itachi cut down any vampire on his path with practiced hand and without regrets. Unlike normals that simply turned to smoke, the blued vamps turned to lights. Their glow was everywhere, setting a scene for the battlefield. Itachi saw some hunters fall from their horse and beaten by the vampires. He tried to rescue them but when he got there and slit the throats of the vampires, the hunters were no longer breathing. Itachi stared once at their glassy eyes and pained expression and for the first he felt something burn in his throat. With a cry he cut down more vampires. They were whining. Juno had gone down from his horse and freed a cage. Itachi saw his brothers, 6 years or so, hug him with tears gushing down like rain. Itachi looked back on his battle for a moment to slit the throat of a vampire running towards him, and when he turned he saw Juno looking at him, blood spilling from his mouth, his head facing a different direction before it fell from his neck. The whole world went still. Itachi gasped and shifted his horse. Everything was in slow motion and he almost couldn't comprehend the look of shock on the children's blood-sprayed face. They were no longer crying and simply watched as their brother's body fell. The world started to play again and Itachi heard himself panting. He looked around for the person who had done it. Who did it? Who did it? Left and right he looked. "Geez. I leave you guys alone for one moment and this is what I see." A man with a head of orange hair on a horse held out a scythe, blood dripping from the sharp blade. His hand outstretched, from that distance and with that weapon he was. Blue eyes settled on Itachi. "My bad, was he a friend of yours?" he said. Itachi growled and gripped his reins, sending his horse forward quickly, sword thrust out. He heard his father called him but did not stop, he was already close. 2 vampires stood in his way and he cut them down in one stroke. He was only a few feet away when he sensed something. He couldn't pull the horse to a stop fast enough and he bent backwards, missing the 2 daggers as they veered over his eyes. He heard someone chuckle and sat up on his horse again. The horse had come to a stop in front of the orange-haired man but only a few feet distance left. Itachi turned his eyes to see a white-haired woman wearing a red kimono which was hanging open, exposing her cleavage. She had a fan over her mouth and she smiled coyly at him. "You managed to dodge that, good reflexes," she said. "Yoko, don't compliment the man," the orange-haired man said. "But he is delightfully handsome, and strong too. If I hadn't stopped him he would have hit you," she replied. "Huh? Are you making a joke?" Itachi's brow twisted and he tried to attack again. "Itachi, fall back, now, this is an order," his father called out and he paused. He backed his horse a little more. "We have to go," Fugaku told him, meeting him halfway. "What?" Itachi snarled. "You are no match for these guys, Itachi, we must fall back." Itachi knew that was reasonable but he burned. He couldn't stand seeing that man standing over Juno's head. "Itachi, listen to me," Fugaku said. "They're the Nines, you know what that means." Itachi's eyes went wide. The Nines, they were the strongest race of vampires in the world. It was said that they can't be killed and no one has ever lived to tell what they looked like upon encounter. "If you two think that after all the mess you caused I'm just going to let you walk away, The orange-haired man chuckled. You must be the best comedians in all of Light City. Itachi turned to look at him. His hand shook a little on the sword as the man's aura started to leak out of him like waves of red and black smoke. If you two think that after all the mess you caused I'm just going to let you walk away, the orange-haired man chuckled. You must be the best comedians in all of Light City. Itachi turned to look at him and his hand shook slightly on the sword. The orange-haired vampire had started to release an aura that caused a chill down his spine. He had never seen anything like it. Waves and waves of glowing red light that spread like it could corrode anything on contact. Itachi swallowed and pulled back his horse a little. He wanted to put as much distance as possible between himself and the man. Around him the battle raged on. He heard cries of pain, anger, rage, and mostly he heard the sound of defeat. He knew that they were no longer whining. The coming of the two nines had turned their favor and now they were all going to die. There was no way they could live not with these monsters here. Itachi struggled with the knowledge and it was a bitter truth to swallow, but it was the truth. Sasuke and their mother might be in one of those cages, hoping he'd save them, but he wasn't sure he could save himself, let alone them. Make sure none of them escape. The orange-haired man shouted and raised his scythe up, then he set his blue eyes on Itachi. Itachi met those blue eyes and felt something cold slither around his chest. The orange-haired vampire had already kicked his horse forward and was charging for him, the scythe prepared to cut down anything in his path, and Itachi was in his path. Quickly he tried to react, to lift his sword and block that hit. Even though it might be impossible to survive this battle, he wanted to at least try. Where did all the things he learned from Hunter's Academy go? The things his father taught him? He couldn't remember any of them over the fear, such fear that made him sick to his stomach. He had succeeded in raising his sword despite his shaking hands, but he knew they would never hold against impact. His hand was sweaty and shaky, and though he told himself to get a grip, get his thoughts together, think of something other than the man racing for him like a huge tide wave, he couldn't see anything else. He shut his eyes on reflex, the kind that hunters should never have when there was a vampire about to slit his throat and cut off his head. His father always told him, never shut your eyes, son. Look them in the eyes while you kill them. It was too late to remember that now though, and that's why he deserved to die, for forgetting something so important. The scythe should have gutted him by now, but he felt nothing and heard only the clang of swords. Itachi opened his eyes again and he exhaled the breath he had not known he'd been holding. His father stood on foot with his spear meeting the scythe, his huge muscles strained under the weight of the heavy-looking scythe. Itachi enjoyed the relief that the sight brought him, but what followed was a bucket load of self-loath that ate him from inside out. He wasn't a child anymore. How could he let himself be in a situation where his father would come save him? All that training and he still needed to depend on his father like this. How useless can he get? His father must be angry too at his uselessness. He had thought that Itachi was knowledgeable enough to never let his guard down like this. What are you doing, Itachi? His father yelled. Itachi jumped and clutched his sword and reins. He expected the look of disgust on his father's face, but all he found was an urgency that terrified him. It was a look he'd never seen on his father's face, not like that. There was fear in his charcoal dark eyes and the strain on his shoulders must be tiring. Itachi moved to help, but his father shook his head. He did not know what that meant. With a yell his father's muscle bulged and flexed and he threw the vampire off the horse. Itachi's internal joy was cooled by the sight of said vampire flying in the air as if he'd had simply decided to change his position, and when he perched his expression did not change. He took a stance with his scythe held pointing forward, one foot positioned in front of the other. Huh, said the vampire. You are pretty strong for such an old man. I suppose those muscles are not for show. Need a hand, Yahiko? A sensual voice said. It belonged to the white-haired vampire Yoko, as she was called. She was seated on her horse, her hand fan moving up and down over her chest and a smile on her lips as if she was in theater enjoying a good play. Itachi furrowed his brows and told himself not to get distracted. Their confidence would be their demise, he thought. He just needed a way to make that possible. His father was already engaged with the orange-haired vampire, and though Itachi was not ignorant enough to think that would be sufficient to hold that vampire down, it certainly wouldn't help if he was attacked from two fronts. Hence Itachi steeled himself to fight the female vampire. If all he could do was keep her from attacking his father, then that was what he'd do. He also needed to remember everything the Hunter's Academy taught him about the nines. They were 9 in number, only 3 in total were known by the Hunters Association, one named Deidara. The other Nishiki, the name of the last one was unknown, but his portrait was in many books. They used it to tell them to run whenever they meet this man. That man had white hair and was supposed to be the strongest of the 9. The one fact Itachi did not want to remember was that the 9s were immortal. They could not be killed, not with Hunter's weapon at least. They walk under the sun like it was nothing. Hence why no vampire had bothered with going after them. Now how was he going to come up with a plan to do the impossible? Itachi, listen to me, do not get distracted. You have to go with the rest of our people. His father shouted towards him. Itachi's eyes flickered from Yoko, whom he realized he'd been staring at for a while, into his father's face. Go? Did his father still think that was a choice, if it was even possible? That orange-haired vampire would never let them get very far, even if they did manage to escape somehow. His father had to know how futile that would be. Itachi opened his mouth to explain, but his father shook his head. This is a losing battle, Itachi. Retreat to fight another day. I will hold them off while you do. He said words Itachi never thought he would hear from him. These words shocked Itachi to his bone, and he stared at his father like he'd never seen the man before. Was this the same man who despised deserters with a passion and would ruthlessly tear them a new one if they ever tried to run from a battle? Rather conceited to think you could take on the 2 of us, Yoko said, and look around you, you have no one to save. Itachi did, and what he saw caused his throat to close up and he couldn't breathe. Vampires, with their mouths stained with so much blood, stood around the site, and there was no hunter standing. All were in bits and pieces, bitten, eaten. Itachi couldn't tell the difference. Limbs were torn from bodies, blood everywhere, heads rolling like balls. Itachi felt sick to his stomach. He retched and looked away, tears stinging his eyes. Those men and women were not even real hunters yet. They had just graduated Hunter's Academy after 2 years, and only an hour ago they had been celebrating, laughing. No one, not one person, had seen this coming. Though they were strong and fought their best, they were still just newbies in hunting. They could never have been able to stand up to an army of blue-eyed vampires. So it was over, Itachi thought. Nothing to fight for anymore. He could already see how this scene would play. He would fight a battle that they had no chance of winning with his father and die with him. Get on with it. What are you waiting for, Itachi? His father's shout shook him from his thoughts, and he lifted his face to see a similar look of despair on his face, yet there was a firm resolve in the charcoal dark eyes. You have to live, even if it's just you. Itachi didn't want that. He didn't want to be the only one who survived. If he was meant to die, then he wanted it to be here with his comrades. He inhaled and sat up straight on his horse. If death was the only option, then at least he'd go down fighting. He raised his eyes and settled them on the female vampire. Yoko chuckled. Looks like he has made his decision. Such a fine specimen of a man. Yahiko, I will be taking him, she announced. Yahiko scoffed. It's always pleasure with you, and here I thought you tagged along to be close to me, he said. In what universe would I be interested in a boring man like you? Yoko replied and smiled. Well, whatever, it's not much of loss for me. Let's wrap this up quickly, Yahiko said, and swung the huge scythe around. Despite his resolve to stay and end this, when the vampire called Yahiko charged, Itachi looked away from his own battle. Only for a moment. The vampire was faster on foot and Itachi could barely see him. However, his father, though not as fast, had good reflexes. He watched with his heart in his throat as the 2 figures exchanged blows so fast he could not see who hit who. A dagger flew right past his nose and almost cut him. He took that as the female vampire's way of saying to look at her, and turned his eyes on her. He let all the anger and hatred that burned through him reflect through his eyes, glaring at her as it was all he could, short of screaming and hitting something. Itachi hated her and her kind so much, and the way she laughed and said, "Don't look away from me, darling, I'm your opponent," made him want to vomit. "I won't," he snarled and held out his sword to the side, preparing for her attack. She raised her fan and waved it at him, and Itachi learned where her daggers were coming from. They came from her fan. This time they split into at least 20 and came at him. He didn't flinch as he used his sword to hit every one of them aside. He caught 2 with his fingers and connected exploding tags on them before shooting them back at her. Of course, she immediately tried to deflect them with her fan, but they exploded right in front of her. Itachi was not demented enough to think that had done it, but he still turned his eyes on his father's battle. His eyes widened and shook at what he saw. What had only seemed nothing but a minute had passed, yet his father, leaking white pale blue aura, was panting and bleeding. His hunter's weapon clutched in one hand, the other holding on to a gaping wound on his stomach. On the other hand, the orange-haired vampire Yahiko had not sustained any injury. He was standing as he did in the beginning, scythe held in front of him, legs one in front of the other. No, that was not entirely true. His clothes were torn under the arm and at the side, and they were no longer pristine white, but still, why was he so unhurt whereas his father? Itachi could not bear to look. He bit his lips and tightened his grip on the horse, prepared to match his horse forward, but a pale hand holding a fan to his neck stopped him short of that. Itachi's blood went cold. He had almost forgotten about his own opponent. Seems like almost was good enough to cost his life. However, the vampire only chuckled. What did I say about looking away from me? I like a man who listens to what I tell him. Look away from me again and I will kill you. Itachi did not shake at the words she used, seductive as if she was telling him something sweet instead of her intention to kill him. He did not move. What do you want from me then? I want to turn you, of course. You would be such a waste as a human. Itachi almost jumped away from her, but the only place he could go was blocked by the dagger, but he was still considering doing it anyway. It would be much better to die than be turned. He couldn't even imagine his life as a vampire. No, he didn't want to imagine that kind of life. He would welcome death with open arms if living meant becoming a vampire. No thank you, he said, and twisted his sword so it pointed at her stomach. He did not hesitate for a moment and drove it into her stomach. Then he pushed her off his horse, drawing out his blood-stained sword. He was a little surprised that he'd actually hit her, but he didn't stop to check if he had indeed. Instead, he hurried on his horse towards his father, and behind him he heard a chuckle that turned into a full-blown mad laugh. Yahiko scoffed. Lost it already, Yoko? Wonderful. Marvelous. I like a man I can chase. Give me a challenge, boy. Make me hot. She was crazy, Itachi thought. Bleeding and laughing she stood. He spared her a glance and then ignored her in favor of reaching out a hand to his father. Grab my hand, father, he called. One of his father's eyes had swollen shut. He used the only good one and raised his hand up to take his hand as Itachi got closer. Itachi decided that staying here wouldn't help them. His father was hurt, badly. They needed time to recuperate. The vampires would surely come after them, but at least they would have time. He wasn't sure how much time that would be or what use it would be, but he couldn't bear it anymore. He needed to get his father out of there. He did not expect his father to pull his hand away and use his fist to smack the flank of the horse, causing it to move faster in a surge of speed. Don't you stop that horse, his father shouted at him, and Itachi tried to stop it. There was no way he'd leave like that. How would he live with himself knowing he'd left his father to die? Stop him! Yahiko yelled. A spear went through the head of the first vampire that came to block his way just as Itachi gripped the reins to stop the horse. The horse made a loud whine and toppled, sending him down the hill. He hit his head on the ground many times and was blinded by dust. Some entered his lungs, and yet the falling continued. Hurting like nothing he'd experienced, he thought he broke an arm, and when it finally stopped he couldn't move. The coppery taste of blood in his mouth made him realize that this was bad. Painfully, he tried to open his eyes, and only one could open all the way. The first thing he saw was a blue-eyed vampire coming towards him with his sword held on one hand. He was saying something, but Itachi must have gone deaf because he couldn't hear a thing. Still, he knew what would happen if that vampire got to him. He reached into his coat pocket for an exploding tag, and God, he couldn't move his left arm. It was definitely broken. He rolled with a loud groan and started to crawl away with his right arm. He crawled blindly and almost fell down to the end of the cliff. He could see the shimmer of water below. The distance should be about 1,000 feet high, if not more. He couldn't tell. He must have fallen further than he thought. Itachi slowly turned his head and saw the vampire reach for him. It didn't seem that the vampire wanted to kill him, because why was he reaching out with his free hand when he had a good sword on the other that could finish the job? Itachi realized that the vampire was not trying to kill him but to help him up, which was crazy and terrifying. He remembered what the female vampire Yoko had said, and a fear more painful than his wounds flashed through his mind. Itachi struggled almost unconsciously. He couldn't become a vampire. He'd rather die. And if this vampire won't do it, then... Itachi waited until the vampire picked him up to his feet, then he kicked him as hard as he could, hoping his failing strength would be enough. It wasn't enough to push the vampire away, but it was enough to get him to let Itachi go. Itachi sighed when he started to fall backwards. He felt relief. He closed his eyes. They were hurting anyway. His father was dead. He was sure of it. He had tried to save Itachi, but this is what happened. It was so much better. Darkness played at the edge of his vision, and he did not fight it. He let his hand fall beside him and prayed he tore to pieces when he reached the end of the fall. Better yet, let him become fish food. Something tickled his forehead and he tried to swat it away, but he couldn't move his left hand. Something heavy was on it. The tickling continued and he really wanted to scratch it. He turned his head to one side to escape the feeling, yet it moved to his ears and neck. He tried to say something but his throat was so dry and patched to his lungs. "He is waking up," someone said. Itachi did not recognize the voice. It sounded gruff and belonged to a man. He tried to open his eyes and they wouldn't work. They felt glued shut and no matter how he tried he couldn't. Why was everything so foggy? He couldn't remember what he was doing here or how he got here or who he was. Nothing made sense. He started to feel agitated, and that was not just because the tickling was still going on. He felt like he shouldn't be there, like something was wrong. What was wrong was he didn't know where he was, who the person or persons, as he felt someone breathing over his face and a hand fall on his head, were. I think his fever broke. Another voice, younger and lighter than the first. Itachi would not be surprised if it belonged to a woman. Yeah, I would be worried if it didn't. I'm so glad. You think he'd be hungry when he wakes? Yeah, I'm pretty sure he will be. I will go see if I can hunt something. Don't go too far, Zabuza. There was worry in that voice that made Itachi believe this woman was most likely the wife or sister to the man. When do I ever? He stopped for some reason and there was silence. Yeah, don't worry too much. When the man left, Itachi felt the woman exhale, her clean breath ghosting over his forehead which had started to sweat. Her hand slowly glided a damp cloth on his forehead. It was so soothing, and though he still needed to know where he was and who they were and also do that thing that nagged at his mind, but he couldn't remember what it was. He couldn't help his weakened body as it dragged him to the depth of a dreamless sleep that he somehow knew he did not deserve. The next time he came to, the feeling was gone, the tickling, replaced by warm breeze. He felt cool and refreshed, but he still couldn't move his hand. He tried and a sharp pain tingled all the way to his head. A groan escaped his lips before he could help it. He didn't want the people that owned this place, wherever it was, to know he was awake, yet it had been too painful and it slipped out involuntarily. He tried his eyes again and thankfully this time they opened. He didn't know what he'd do if they hadn't. Surviving that fall had not been his plan, but neither was going blind. If he went blind now, then he didn't know what he'd do. He just knew he couldn't afford it. So his eyes opened and they stared at the white ceiling of what appeared to be a small room. He couldn't tell if it was somewhere familiar simply by looking at it, so he tried to turn his neck. It hurt, dearly. He must have cricked it when he had gone back to sleep in a bad position. Still he struggled with the pain and managed to turn left. There was a door, but there was no door. It was an entryway covered by a tattered-looking hide of some animal he couldn't identify. It was definitely nowhere he's ever been, that was for certain now. Which meant two things. He had been captured by those despicable but fear-inspiring blue-eyed vampires, or he was in the house of a really poor person who may or may not be his savior. He quickly ruled out the former because he couldn't imagine any blue-eyed vampire living in such a place. Not with the way Elfheim was. That place only had things of quality that was the envy of every nation beyond Light City. Itachi saw movement behind the curtain and shut his eyes so that anyone who entered would not know he was awake. Someone entered the room and with him a refreshing smell, like buttermilk mixed with something spicy. It didn't seem very womanly, since when the person spoke it appeared to be the voice of the woman who took care of him when he first awoke. Carefully, Itachi attempted a peek. He opened one eye up to a tiny crack, but all he could see was the blurred version of the entryway. He opened it slightly wider and moved them a little to the left, where a small-looking man in short briefs and white shirt gone brown stood in front of a broken mirror tying his excessively long hair. The body started to turn and Itachi closed his eyes quickly. Hey, are you awake? Itachi wasn't about to answer. He stayed quite still and made his face remain slack. He heard the man exhale. You should wake up soon. How long are you going to sleep? Itachi waited until it seemed that the man had left, the smell of buttermilk taken with him. So the person he had thought a woman was actually a man. That was not reassuring at all. He started to sit up despite the world of pain that caused his left eye to tear up. He felt like his ribs were broken. His head had started to pound and now he was sweating and panting. He didn't think he could make it out of this room, but he needed to try. He had no reason to think that man was not dangerous, however kind he appears. Itachi almost crumbled to the ground upon standing, but caught himself on the bed, which was actually made of straw. The pain on his left leg was blinding. A groan escaped his gritted teeth and he exhaled fast, hoping it would cool the burning ache. He sat on the cemented floor and held his left leg, his brows furrowed at the sight of bandages wrapped around it. Was it broken? It must be. It hurt like it was. Now how would he leave this place with a broken leg? Not to talk of leaving, his noise had brought someone coming in through the curtain. "Are you all right? What are you doing up?" The alarmed voice wasn't helping as the pain did not go down a notch. Hands wrapped around his underarm trying to pull him up, probably back to the bed, but he wasn't helping and the man seemed pretty weak. Was he really a man? He looked too good to be a man. Itachi tried to distract himself from the pain by taking note of the large frantic brown eyes and heart-shaped pale face whilst the man struggled with his weight. "Zabuza, quick, come help me." Another man hurried into the room. He looked like a thug, very much like the ones who went about bullying people in Hunter's Academy. His dark brown hair cut short and he was wearing a dirty sleeveless shirt and a black torn at the hem trouser. Itachi started to lose it when the man lifted him like he weighed nothing and put him on the bed. Itachi had the fleeting thought that the man was not from Light City, he was too dark-skinned to be, before he lost consciousness. Once again, he came to. The pain had lessened to none and his eyes opened this time without difficulty. It was dark, there was no window in the room, however the curtain was not letting in any light. Itachi stayed in that position for a while, a little afraid to go through the pain of moving. He needed to move though, but he told himself just a little longer, he'd be ready. He wished he'd slept a little longer, no, maybe he shouldn't have woken up at all. Why did he survive? That fall he had been certain would kill him, yet here he was, alive. The pain he felt that time proved it, so now what was he going to do? Obviously he needed to get out of there, but then what? Return to the village? What could be waiting for him at home? Sasuke, his mother. Were they even alive? Itachi shied away from the thought, he couldn't handle it. His father was already dead, killed by the blue-eyed vampires. If he thought about even the possibility that Sasuke and his mother were dead as well, he did not know if he'd be able to go on. He'd not be able to continue living. Sasuke was only 11 years old, turning 12 on July, and his mother was frightfully ill. There's no way they could have escaped those vampires. Unless, he didn't dare hope, but if they were not at the village the time it happened, then Itachi did not want to know, and at the same time it was killing him not to know. A light source, a candle most likely, came closer until the man he'd confused for a woman entered the room. He stared at Itachi for a while, then a wide smile spread across his lips. Itachi did not see what was so good it excited that much joy. "You are awake." He seemed truly pleased and dropped the candle on the only table in the room near the moss-caked walls. "How are you feeling?" Itachi swallowed and opened his mouth to say something, but his voice came out sounding like he had a strong dry cough. "Oh wait, don't say anything, I will get you some water." Like a breeze the small man flew out of the house and inside again with a clean cup of water. He wrapped his thin arm around Itachi's shoulder and fed him the water. It was refreshingly cold and had a sweet taste. Itachi wondered what it was instead of worrying about why it had such a taste. After the man fed him all of it, he set him down on the straw bed and pushed Itachi's bang from his face. It was a kind gesture and it stirred up Itachi's emotion. His mother used to do that for him when he was sick or about to sleep. It was a long time ago, yet right at that moment it felt so vivid that Itachi had to look away to hide his emotions. "Better?" Itachi nodded and turned back again once he got his face back to his normal slack expressionless facade. "Thank you," he said. His voice sounded dry and hoarse, but his throat no longer felt like it was permanently glued shut. "It's nothing. My name is Haku, do you remember yours?" "My name is Itachi." He paused for a moment, wondering if it was even necessary to ask, but did anyway. Even if he wasn't completely grateful for being saved, he still wanted to thank the man. "Did you save me?" he asked. Haku had a warm, kind smile on his face, and Itachi honestly couldn't think of him as a man when he looked like that. He was too beautiful and gave off a motherly air about him. "Yeah, I saw you floating near the village, so I did. You were hurt pretty bad." The way he said it made Itachi think he must know something. Something about him, but he didn't know if he should ask. "Where am I?" he asked. "You are in Konoha, it's not far from Uchiha village." Itachi looked at him a moment longer and realized Haku must know who he was. "I see. Thank you for saving me." "It's no problem. I'm practicing to be a doctor anyway, and you are my first real patient." Itachi looked at the man and couldn't find anything wrong with him. He was kind, warm, and not at all a dangerous person. "How long have I been your patient?" "Only over a week." "You healed quickly. Maybe it has to do with your hunter's aura, it is really strong." "Not nearly strong enough, or he won't be in this position. To be so easily hurt by a fall down the hill." How pathetic. It did not matter that he survived that fall, he should have just died there. Thank you very much. 2 mornings later Itachi found he could walk with a stick, not very far or for very long, but with this he no longer had to overstay his welcome. The thug-looking man had come many times over those 2 days, and though he had a disagreeable air about him he tried to be nice, yet Itachi got the idea that the man thought of him as a burden. When he walked out of the room he had used for 1 week and 2 days, he realized that outside was a bust of life and activity. It had been so quiet inside that it came as a shock to see so much people walk in about talking, buying, selling and so on. Houses just as small as the one he'd stayed lined the streets with half tents to hold their goods which they sold. In fact, the one he had stayed also had one of those tents, and it seemed Haku's main trade was on herbs and milk. That explained the smell he had on him all the time. Itachi blinked away his discomfort at being in the midst of this much people and gripped the walking stick tightly before taking 2 more practice steps outside the tent. Something crashed to the ground in front of him, and hands, familiar thin ones thankfully, or he was about to use his walking stick as a weapon on the person, wrapped around him. Where are you going? You can't walk on that foot yet. Itachi looked down at the long hair that belonged to Haku and couldn't help the surprise. This man was excessively affectionate, but he'd never held Itachi like this before. It was a little uncomfortable, but Itachi bared with it. I'm going home, Haku. I told you yesterday, Itachi said. You said you would go home, but you didn't say it was today. You are not healed yet. Haku raised his wide brown eyes and looked at him, and Itachi almost sighed. He used one hand to pull Haku away from him and tried to smile. Haku, I have to. I'm grateful for what you've done for me, but I can't stay here anymore. He tried to sound calm and reassuring. What Haku did for him he'd never forget, but he didn't want to be a burden anymore. Why not? No one is complaining. I don't mind taking care of you until you are back to full health. Itachi knew it was the truth. That there was such a person who would wholeheartedly give himself to caring for a stranger. Itachi never thought such a person existed until now. He was grateful for meeting him, and he would never forget Haku, hence he must leave whilst he was not yet a burden. I know, but I must return home. There are things I must do. Haku looked torn. But you are not healed yet. How would you make it home by yourself? You don't even have a horse. I would give him one, Haku, so you won't have to worry. Itachi found Zabuza standing beside the tent with his arms crossed over his chest. He spied Haku giving Zabuza a glare, and he smiled. Over the 2 days he distracted himself by trying to figure out their relationship. The 2 men cared about each other, yet they were not brothers, and he couldn't say they were friends since they argued a little too much. No one asked you, Zabuza, Haku said. Hey, I'm offering. I don't want him to go. Okay. Why? He obviously wants to. Haku turned his gaze on Itachi, and they seemed to plead that he not go. Itachi smiled with what he felt was a genuine affection for this beautiful man. I will be fine, I promise. With that he followed Zabuza to where he kept his horses. Apparently Zabuza traded in horses. He was also the second in command of this village. Itachi noticed the pistols he kept behind him in his trouser and had wanted to ask, because even though he could feel the energy radiating from them he could not believe it. Zabuza, I have wanted to ask, but I never thought it was appropriate to, but are those hunters' weapons? He had lost his sword after the fight with the nines, and it had felt like he'd lost a limb. He knew he'd need a hunter's weapon if he was to travel back to the Uchiha village, yet he was not strong to get one. Yes, why? You think cause I'm not a hunter I don't got to own one? Zabuza replied and turned his hard narrow brown eyes at Itachi. Itachi refused to flinch at that gaze and met it without so much as a bat of his eyelashes. No, I just wanted to know if they were, and if so where you got them. Zabuza looked at him for a moment, then turned away to start preparing the straddle for one of the horses. With brown fur and lean legs the horse looked strong and like a fast runner. It could even be one of the best of the bunch. Yeah, well, I got it from the Sorcerer's Mountain, that's all I'm going to tell you, he said. That's plenty, Itachi said and took the reins from Zabuza. If it was the Sorcerer's Mountain, then he must be from the Fire City. Itachi had always suspected as much, and this confirmed it. It was a struggle to get on the horse, but he managed, standing with his right leg first before throwing his bandaged left leg over the other side. Tell Haku I'm grateful, and it was nice meeting you, Zabuza. He kicked the horse forwards and had to stop when Haku suddenly blocked his way, arms held wide. Haku, what are you doing, you fool? That was dangerous. Zabuza yelled and appeared to drag him out of the way. I'm going with you, Haku shouted at Itachi, and his eyes went wide. What? He shared the same sentiment with Zabuza, who had eyes wide and his hand clamped on Haku's. Itachi did not comprehend Haku sometimes, but this was too much. Why? He asked. Because you are my patient, I know you are going to need me. Haku said it in such a way that made Itachi realize he must know something. What do you mean? He narrowed his eyes and looked Haku up and down with suspicion. Haku shook off Zabuza's hand and moved to stand on the side of the horse. You'll see. He held out his hand to Itachi, and Itachi did not know whether to take it. Zabuza obviously wanted Haku to stay and not leave with the stranger he saved, and Itachi was also of the same mind, but Haku had a stubborn look that said if Itachi didn't let him on the horse he would do something drastic. With a sigh, Itachi reached out a hand to take Haku's and pull him onto the horse. The look of utter despise on Zabuza's face was more than he could take, so he averted his eyes. I will be back, Zabuza, Haku said, and Itachi kicked the flank of the horse to propel it forwards. On horseback it took them 2 hours to get to Uchiha village, or what was left of it. Itachi didn't stop at where the gate used to be, where now lies a pile of burnt wood. He went straight for his home in the middle of the village, forming a forked street. At breakneck speed they arrived, and he almost forgot his bad leg to jump down, but Haku stopped him short of that. The building itself, a one-story, seemed to be the standing, but only just. Its roof was gone, damaged by fire, and the walls were charred, but they were made from brick, so it did not collapse. Itachi hurried inside as fast as his bad leg could go. He found it empty, as he had half expected, but the blood, God, there was so much of it. Dried and caked on the floor and walls. So many people died here. Vampires don't leave blood, they turn to dust or lights in the case of the full blood. This had to be the blood of someone. Itachi almost crumbled when he saw his mother's knitted scarf stained with blood, but nothing broke him more than those 2 daggers stained with blood. He fell to his knees in front of them and panted as he tried to reach for them. His vision blurred and he couldn't take it. A groan escaped him. No, he muttered, shaking his head. He couldn't pick up the blades. They lay there within reach, and they terrified him and made his heart break into pieces. No, he cried out loud, so loud because he feared if he didn't he would tear to pieces. He would burn inside out. They're dead. He didn't realize until that moment how much hope he still had in him, until there was none, and it hurt so much, he couldn't help the sounds he was making as tears spilled out of his eyes. Someone hugged him from behind, and he turned subconsciously into it, seeking salvation, seeking reprieve from the pain. Sasuke, Sasuke. Oh, how could he have left them alone? He should have been there. His little brother, he was only 11, he would turn 12 come July. Sasuke, he is dead. So were their mother and their father. He had no one left. The blue-eyed vampire took it all. They destroyed him. How was he going to survive this? How could he go on? He couldn't. He felt someone rocking him side to side while saying things he couldn't hear, but they felt good and his heart ached a little less. You are not alone. He heard those words and he really couldn't believe it, dearly. He wanted to, for what was he but a dead man walking if he didn't? Hours flew by and an old woman came to speak with him. She showed him where she and the survivors buried their dead, but she was not sure which was Sasuke and his mother, but they showed him his father's. The survivors had gone to the place of battle and retrieved the bodies of the fallen. Itachi fell to his knees in front of his father's grave and looked at the one they'd titled as his grave. Apparently they thought he died with the others, and Itachi did not try to correct them. He might as well be. He knelt there for hours until Haku came and dragged him away. He didn't put up much of a resistance. As they returned to Konoha, Haku's village, Itachi said nothing. He could only think about what he should do now, and he couldn't help that his mind returned to that battle fought on the hill. It had gotten dark whilst they were still on their way back. Itachi decided he'd go once he got to Konoha. He'd go to Elfheim. He didn't know what he'd do, but he would find out once he got there. I'm leaving for Elfheim tomorrow. He interrupted whatever Haku was saying and met the brown eyes. Going for revenge? He asked. Itachi did not know. Was there even a way he could get revenge? Those monsters could not be killed. I hope you know how futile that is. Why don't you stay here until you've finished mourning and think about this a little more? I'm going, was all he said, and Haku must have heard the finality in his voice or decided to take up the argument another time, but he didn't say anything else. It no longer mattered what he thought, it was the decision he'd made and nothing would change that. As they arrived at the village, Itachi noticed something was amiss. The busy road they had passed was void of people and the lights were turned off. Something is wrong. Haku voiced his thought. He sped up their horse and arrived at the center of town. Itachi sensed them then, normals. Haku, get off the horse slowly and find somewhere to hide, he said with a dispassionate voice and hoped Haku would not question him and just do what he said. Haku did exactly that and Itachi got off the horse too. He didn't have a hunter's weapon but something sharp would do. He scanned the place and found an axe buried in a log of wood. Just as he started for it, the wind picked up and two normals had leapt into the opening. Hissing with their fangs on display, they were disgusting. Itachi twisted his lips and leapt for the axe. He turned just in time to bury it into the head of the first normals that leapt at him, and when it fell, Itachi ignored the complaints of his broken and still healing leg, did a quick turn. While pulling the axe out the normal's head, he swung it upwards and buried it through the chin of the other normals that had run towards him. He pulled the axe from the vampire's brain and looked around to see more had gathered. He suddenly felt good. Despite all the pain, both physical and emotional, he was going through, his body was on fire. A bloodthirst for every vampire that walked the earth, but first he planned to start with these ones. He counted about 15, but it didn't matter. Come at me, he begged. Let me use all of you as a warning to every vampire that lives. Come. They did, and oh, it felt good to bury that axe into their flesh and rip it out. The sound, the blood, it was euphoric. By the time all 15, or was it 20, he had not counted, had died, he was sopping wet with their blood, and of course when their body turned to dust, so did their blood. His face blackened with it. He flung the axe aside and turned to see Haku and some other witnesses look at him with various levels of horror. It probably had to do with the way he had killed those vamps, torn them limb from limb. They must have thought he was crazy. Maybe he was, Itachi thought. He just about had enough of those vampires. Haku, Zabuza is. Someone was whispering those words to Haku, and Itachi saw the man's face go white before he took off in a run without so much as a look Itachi's way. When Itachi finally made it to where there was a large crowd, everyone seemed to want to stare at him and at the same time keep their distance. He didn't mind so much, he didn't want to be touched by anyone anyway. Itachi found a gap open for him as soon as he came close, and soon he found Haku holding a bleeding Zabuza. It seemed his wound was from the neck, even though there were cuts in other places. Itachi narrowed his eyes. Had he been bitten? His eyes scanned for something sharp and he found those hunter's weapon, the pistols Zabuza had been carrying, on the ground. He walked towards them and picked them. When he turned towards Haku, he found the man staring at him with wide eyes. He could see the fear in them. Why would Haku be afraid of him? All he just wanted to do was kill Zabuza before he turned, which he would after being beaten by a normals. Itachi pointed the gun at the shaking body, and suddenly Haku was in front of him, hands wide. No, don't kill him, he cried. I have to, he is going to turn into a vampire soon. It's the only way to stop it, Itachi said. Haku shook his head. No, please. Is it that Haku did not understand, or was he being intentionally ignorant? Itachi said nothing but continued pointing the gun. He'd not let a vampire live, that was his resolve. He would never forgive those damned blue-eyed vampires, not one of them. Kill the king and they all die, Haku shouted. Itachi could see the desperation in his eyes. What? He asked without moving his lips much. You want revenge, right? If you killed the king of the blue-eyed vampire, they all die. He is lying. Itachi had never heard of something so ridiculous. He had read books after books of the Nines and who they were, what they do, but nothing about the king being the key to their death. What are you talking about? I heard it, from one of the blue-eyed vampires. He said that their king was their life source, that's why they never let him out of the castle. It's too risky to let him out, Haku said quickly. Itachi thought about that. It didn't seem like Haku was lying just to get him to not kill Zabuza, even if that was the point, but it felt surreal. Just kill the king? It can't be that simple, yet it was worth investigating. It was true about the king of Elfheim being locked up in his palace, never coming out once, but no one ever related it to that being the reason. Itachi exhaled and dropped his hand. What will you do? He asked. Haku swallowed. I will take care of him, please. Just go to Elfheim like you said you would, he said. Itachi looked away from those eyes that seemed about to cry and nodded. He wondered if it was too late to say thank you. If Haku would even appreciate it after what just happened. Tell him I will be taking this. He held up the pistols. It's no use to him now anyway. He turned and started down the road, wanting to turn back and look one last time at the person who comforted him at the time of his pain, but he didn't. He tucked the pistols into his inner coat and thought of what route to take to Elfheim. He decided to cut through the Forest of Light. It was quicker. He'd be in Elfheim in 4 days tops on horse. Itachi leapt as quickly as he could over trees and perched briefly on branches to leap again. It's been almost an hour since he escaped from Akatsuki Mansion with the king, and he knew by now Elfheim would be in chaos. If it were true and this person really was the life force of every blue-eyed vampire, then they should be already after him. The forest was eerily quiet, no sounds of crickets or owls. Owls usually roamed the light forest, but now they were in hiding. Itachi did not stop. His legs burned to stop and the weight on his shoulder grew heavier by the minute, but he could not even think about stopping. It had taken him 3 years to get this opportunity and succeed. He was not about to let it slip by him. He knew what the consequences would be if he did. Itachi was also aware of the chances he had taken in order to do this. There was no real proof that it would work, but he had nothing but his life to lose if it didn't work, hence why he did not involve anyone in on his plan. He stole into Elfheim like the humans that seemed to favor the place and took up a job as a mailman where he learned everything he needed to know about Elfheim's system, tradition, principles. He had to wait patiently every day for the right opportunity while putting up with the detest that he felt towards every blue-eyed vampire he'd met. He practiced keeping up an emotionless mask, and every now and then it cracked, but he just fixed it up again. It all worked out in the end. The king was in his grasp, not even struggling, just lying still on his back. Itachi turned to check that he was still alive, and their blue eyes were not on him but on the space behind him. Itachi did not bother to see what was so interesting there and just picked up his speed. Another hour and he was at the port. He let go off his burden so the childlike body of the king fell on the ground with a thud. Then he pulled out his cuffs and grabbed the small hand of the king. They were small and thin for someone who had supposedly lived in wealth and lacked for nothing. Itachi did not care what the true story was about the king. All he cared was getting somewhere far away from Elfheim. As he clamped the cuffs around the king's hand, he paused at the sound of fluttering leaves. The trees were tilting and swaying. Damn it, they were already close, Itachi thought. He pulled out a robe from his sack bag and threw it over the king's body to hide the elegant and kingly clothes the king was wearing and tugged the hood over his head. Then he roughly pulled him along to aboard the ship. Many people were amongst them, but yet Itachi could not rest until the ship set sail. He followed the long line of women and men that were headed for the ship. Much to his chagrin, the conductor was there, checking for ids. Whilst Itachi had his in his pocket, the king was another matter. Plus those blue eyes would be a dead giveaway. Look down and don't say anything. Your id, be quick about it, the irate conductor said through yellowish teeth. Itachi showed his to the man, and when the man looked at it he nodded and handed it back. And his? He'd forgotten his ID, but he is with me, Itachi explained. No, can't do. They've been a lot of pirates out at sea these few days. They've been coming like passengers, causing trouble for we lot. But he is just a child. This was taking too long. At this rate those vampires would be here. So they always say, but it's the child that be their weapon. Seen it happen to a friend. Just when Itachi thought the man would start going on about his story, the king raised his head and pulled the hood away from his face. Let us through, he said, looking at the conductor with those blue eyes that made Itachi's skin crawl. Why, of course. The man suddenly smiled with a love-struck expression and stepped aside for them. Itachi was still reeling from the shock when the king turned slightly and looked at him with a smile he could almost term mischievous if they did not make his inside freeze. What are you waiting for? He said. Voice, slightly hoarse but rich, like one he would not find misplaced on a bard. Itachi blinked and quickly pushed the king inside the ship. Once inside he grabbed him by the collar and held him pressed against a wall. The king's leg dangled from the ground. What was that? The king's hood fell away from his face, showing that which deceptively resembled an 11-year-old boy. His skin was pale like everyone Itachi had ever met who was a native of Light City, but it was those blue eyes that held him still. They had a light in them, a purity that felt to him as watching fine sapphire enshrouded in something filthy. Whatever do you mean? The innocence was not even worth considering. Did this king take him for a fool? Itachi tightened his hand around the king's throat to cut off his air. What did you do? He emphasized every word through gritted teeth. The king closed one eye, obviously having difficulty breathing, but did not reply Itachi. It happened so fast, but suddenly before he could blink Itachi found himself facing the roof of the ship, his back flat against the creaky floorboards. The king sat on him and grinned. Itachi struggled to get up and push him off, but to no avail. It felt like 6 if not 7 bags of cement had been placed on top of him, but it was ridiculous. He tried to reach for his gun, but the king had already started running thin fingers up and down his body searching for it. He struggled. They were in the pocket of his pants and the king found them. "Here we go," he said and grinned, holding up the weapon that should have burned him as if they were toys. "These are quite dangerous, aren't they?" "They used to be," Itachi said and scowled. How can he hold them like that? Better yet, why had he not shown his true strength until now? He was obviously stronger than he looked. "Oh, you've stopped struggling. Does that mean you are willing to talk?" The king looked at him with those damned eyes that made Itachi want to renew his struggle, but it was futile. He couldn't shake off that weight, and it was better if he did not waste his energy and abide his time. He took a moment to think. He might have a lot on his hand right now. "Talk about what?" Itachi asked. "Well, first thing first, why did you kidnap me? It's not something most hunters would come up with." The king had the pistols in one hand while the other cupped his chin, and he looked at Itachi as if expecting a story. Itachi sneered. "No reason." The king scoffed. "That's hard to believe. Tell me the truth." He said it in a way like he expected Itachi to just obey him. "How about you get off me and I will. Promise you won't try to fight me?" "Sure." Itachi had of course planned to fight him tooth and nail. Even for the weapon he was no longer sure could kill the king, but when the king really got off him he was a bit apprehensive to try fighting him for it. Did the king really take his word for it, or did he just have that much confidence that Itachi would not be able to best him? Itachi clenched his fist but did not try to attack. He'd find a weak spot, his chance, and then he'd take it. "Would you be kind and get this off? They are uncomfortable." The king seemed to whine and Itachi smiled. "They are? Then they should stay." "All right, fine. Tell me why you kidnapped me." "Isn't it obvious? Because I want to kill you." Present tense, because he still wanted to kill the monster who destroyed everything he had. That seemed to shock the king and his small mouth formed an O shape. "Why? Did I do something?" Itachi did not know how to go about answering that. It was such an absurd question it left him speechless. "What do you think?" he said. "But you can't kill me, not yet, but be assured that I will keep trying until I do." "What could you possibly gain from killing me?" the king asked with such an alarmed voice Itachi almost believed he did not know. "I don't know, perhaps the complete annihilation of your kind," his sarcasm dripping. "And you think my death would give you this?" Itachi did not grace that with a response. If he didn't think it, then why would he risk his neck to kidnap him? "I see. Well, you can't kill me." He stated it in such a matter-of-fact way that did not leave room to mean anything else. "Why not?" Itachi was now the one asking. If he was lucky, the king would spill his own secrets. "Because I am the only one who knows how you can kill me or my kind," he said. Itachi widened his eyes and stared. The king smiled. "It seems you did not factor the possibility that I might not be so easy to kill." Yes, he had. It had been on his mind since he decided to take up the plan. What if, like those damned nines, the king was also impossible to kill? He had thought hard on it, but in the end, if he did not try, he would never know. He risked everything for this experiment, and as it turns out, he failed. "Let's imagine this for a moment. What did you think would happen after you found out you can't kill me?" the king asked. "Drag you around until I find something that will." Itachi tried acting nonchalant, but he knew that everything was over. If the king was right and he can't be killed, then when those nines find him, and they won't stop until they do, he was as good as dead. The king smiled slightly. "Well, I'm sure you now see the errors in your plans. How about we make a deal?" Did he just say deal? Itachi must not have heard right. Did this monster think he would stoop so low as to make a deal with him? He'd rather die. "I see you don't want that." "Yeah? What was your first clue?" "You hate me. And yet I need you." "What?" The king did not look the least bit uncomfortable and repeated the words. "I'm not going to be your blood bag if that's what you mean." "No, what I need is an excuse, and you are it. I want you to continue acting like you've kidnapped me." The king said some strange things. "What do I gain from that?" Itachi asked. He wasn't considering it, but he wanted to hear the rest of this messed up plan the king was conceiving. "1 week is all I need, then I will tell you how to kill me." The shock was like being shot in the head, and Itachi could not help the way his eyes went wide and his jaw slacked. "What? The king can't be serious." "It's a good deal, right?" The king did not repeat himself, even though Itachi wished that he would. "Why would I believe something like that?" Itachi asked with a sneer. "Because you don't have a choice. My people are already on this ship." The king's eyes held a maturity that did fit in the face of someone so small and fragile looking. He took a step towards Itachi, meeting his eyes as he spoke. So you would need to decide fast. Will you do this? Itachi could feel it now, the aura of very angry vampires circulating the ship like snakes. I won't be rushed to make a decision, he stated despite that. How do I know you would keep your word? The king had moved closer and Itachi had to bend his head to meet those blue eyes. I will not go back on my word, he said. Itachi hated that he felt compelled to trust the king simply because of those eyes and the way he said those words. Quickly, tell me, what is your decision? Itachi tried to delay, but there really was no point to it anyway. He'd die either way. Yes, he said. A smile touched the lips of the king and then he was holding him and Itachi felt the wind rip apart and stir. Then it felt like they were airborne, but he couldn't see anything. Only those eyes that were so blue they outshone the stars. Sasuke cleaned his daggers and tucked them carefully into the back of his backpack, where he could easily pluck them out if he met any vampire on his way. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead and stared at the empty road ahead. Damn, if only a carriage would just drive by, he thought. The sun was practically burning up his skin and he couldn't take another mile of this heat. He dragged his feet not because he was trying to delay anything, but he just couldn't move them any higher than a centimeter. A shade would be nice right about now. It was hard to imagine how anyone could survive in Fire City for a long time. Even though had been living together with his mother in Fire City for 4 years, he never got used to the heat. What was worst was the endless miles of road with no trees or anything that can be used for shade, just a continuous expanse of dry lands, that looked more of a desert than a city. He regretted terribly trading their old donkey for some money to buy food. Perhaps he was only regretting it now when it had run out on his third meal, but it would have been great if he could just reach Mizu, the capital city of Fire City, quickly. Sasuke had a lot of expectations for when he'd arrive, which, at the pace he was going, won't be for at least another 3 days. He'd left Aim, the village he had been living with his mother since their own village was destroyed and ransacked by the blue-eyed vampires, for almost over a week with the hopes of arriving at Mizu in 3 days. Even after burying his mother and mourning her, Sasuke never stopped thinking about going to Mizu. He'd told her he would. Her sickness had turned for worse after his big brother and father were killed during the attack, and when they made it to Aim she collapsed and did not get up after that. Sasuke, mourning and helpless, had to pick up the pieces or they would not survive. For 4 years he looked after her, worked his butt off to get her medicine, yet she died. He had not been at home at the time, simply working overnight at a farm. When he got home she must have been dead for a while because Sasuke swore he smelled her rotting away. He had not found tears then, perhaps it was because he had been expecting it for a while now. Her death had never loomed over his head as it did in these 4 years, and when she died it came as a relief followed by a load of guilt, but a relief all the same. He'd buried her at the back of their house and sat the entire day in that empty room, where she used to lay all the time, with the intention to mourn her. At least that was the plan, but, when he couldn't feel real sorrow and tears would not come, he began to feel impatient. He wanted to leave immediately for Mizu, then from there to Light City. That was the plan he had been saving all those years for, so that very day he gathered up his things, some clothes and food wrapped in a sack bag and thrust into his backpack. He pulled the old donkey from the barn, and then set out for the city. No one would ask after him when he was gone. They had lived in a run-down house in Aim and never had any real neighbors or friends. No one knew them, hence, when he was gone it would seem like he was never there to begin with. In such high spirits he had set out, yet the peril of traveling was so much it dampened that spirit next to none. Sasuke, once again, wiped sweat from his face and continued to walk. If only there were not so many hills to climb. He missed the flatlands of Light City, yet that was not the reason for his journey to the place. His reasons, his mission as he liked to think, was what most people would call ridiculous and childish. However, they were his reasons. He has held them steadfast in his heart ever since the day he'd returned to Uchiha village and found the headstones of his big brother and father. The fact that they were dead took a while to sink in, and when it did Sasuke felt his heart freeze and harden. Cold with hatred that he buried for these last 4 years. Not well enough. His mother had told him once to let go of his anger. He did not know what she had seen on his face, but it was the one time she had been herself, strident and concerned. Though he still treasures the moment he could only will his mother to understand why he cannot do as she wanted. Not even the clammy heat of Fire City, not the long distance yet to be covered to Mizu. nor the lack of luck that had stalked him all the way from aim through Kiri would shake that resolve. Sasuke paused when he thought he saw a carriage being pulled by oxen coming his way, and was so elated he almost sagged to his knees. He stopped and waited for the carriage to get closer. It seemed as if it was getting closer. Perhaps it was the heat confusing him, but the carriage continued being too far away. 5 minutes, and then 10 minutes passed. Sasuke was seated on the ground doodling when the carriage finally made it to him. It was being driven by an old man, probably around his 70s. "Hey old man." Sasuke got up from the ground and dusted his hands on his black pants. "Could you give me a lift? I'm heading for Mizu." "Oh, I am not heading for Mizu, but I can drop you on the way if you want." The old man's voice was shaky, much like every old man Sasuke had ever met, and there were lots of old men in AIM. "Yeah, thanks old man." Sasuke hopped onto the back and sat on a pile of straws. "What is a young lad such as yourself going to do in Mizu?" The old man started to ride again. "Oh, just for sightseeing," Sasuke said, and grinned. "Mizu has a lot of sight to see, don't it? Their women are very beautiful, I am told." Sasuke did not know anything about their women, but he'd heard of the Hunter's Masters, rank Black XX Hunters to be precise, who go and come regularly in Mizu. It would be the perfect place for him to find a master that would teach him what he needed to get stronger. Sasuke knew that in order to get to Light City, and in other words, Elfheim, he'd need to be stronger. Stronger than the monsters that destroyed his village, stronger than any rank Black XX Hunter. In the beginning, when he was still formulating his plan, he had considered the option of attending the Hunter's Academy, but he could not think of one thing they could teach him that he didn't already know. It was also a well-known fact that only rank Red Hunters were teachers in the Hunter's Academy. It would have been a complete waste of time. His father had told him about the various ranks in the Hunters Association. There was the rank White, which also equaled Hunter Academy graduates or newbies. The rank Red, mostly teachers and guardians who do not seek to improve themselves further, in Sasuke's opinion. The rank Black Hunters, also known as First Phase Masters. Then lastly, there was the Black XX Hunters. They were basically the strongest Master Hunters. Of course, they are not the last rank, but his father, who had been a rank Black Hunter, had said he did not consider them part of any rank but in their own level entirely. The rank Black Hunters, also known as Master Hunters. They were very few in numbers, only 7 are known. They stand as the heads of the Hunters Association. His main purpose at this point in going to Mizu is to look for a rank Black XX Hunter. Still, he agreed with the old man. "Yeah, I heard too. They also have a circus and a trade fair." And that began a long pointless conversation that lasted for hours. The sky had gone dark when the carriage arrived at the junction between Kiri and Ogun. He greeted the old man and watched the carriage slowly depart for the village. Sasuke was half tempted to go into the village as well. There would be food and a warm place to sleep, but he had only 6 coins and a bill. It would never survive the night. Shrugging, Sasuke turned to the nice-looking forest Ogun seemed to have in abundance, stretching for miles. It was time to set up camping. Good thing he had that thick blanket he'd gotten from the market. It wouldn't do much other than drive the cold away, but it was something less to worry about. Sasuke walked only a little distance into the woods and found the perfect tree to spend the night. "You look strong," he muttered and made a circle around the tree to check for anything that would make it unfit. Sasuke nodded, and started to climb with his hands and legs. He got to 2 branches above ground and settled on one. Within a few minutes he had his thick blanket out and wrapped around his body, then he waited for sleep. He couldn't even see the moon from behind the shade of leaves. To think he had been looking for shade all these while and now there was too much of it. It was a little funny, but Sasuke could only manage a smile, as his stomach growling ruined it for him. Counting sheep in his head, Sasuke closed his eyes and waited for sleep. Startled awake by the sound of a twig snap, Sasuke held still while his eyes shifted to the ground below him and waited. Something shook the leaves and Sasuke's heart leapt a little and started to race in anticipation. He could not have said what he'd been expecting, but when a man walked into the opening, Sasuke felt his blood pressure plummet like a comet. He almost felt sick with adrenaline coursing through his veins. The man stopped and turned to look at a spot behind. Sasuke remained hidden and made no sound. "How long do you plan on following me?" Sasuke's heart jumped before it occurred to him that the man can't possibly be referring to him. He was far up on the tree, and even if the man were to look up now, the branches kept Sasuke from sight. The leaves rustled for a moment and settled, Then some figures leapt out of them. Normals. Sasuke almost let out a gasp but held it with his palm pressed to his mouth. He watched the leaping vampires. They looked like malnourished humans, their legs long and wiry in a way that reminded him of spider-like appendages. This was not the first time Sasuke had seen a normal, but it was the first time seeing them so close. Their eyes were red, their skin almost black, and their fangs, the most frightening part of their features, was long and elongated out of drooling mouth. Sasuke's eyes shifted to the man who remained standing, but his hand had moved to grip the bandaged object strung to his back. What a pain! Sasuke thought he heard the man say. He did not see anything, but the wind flurried and scattered the dried leaves. The wind pushed upward and swept his hair from his face, but he did not see the man move, yet the vampires stopped in mid-air at the same time and turned to dust. They must have been hit at the same time, or it would not have been possible. Sasuke was so shocked, he froze and stared. The man stood as he had been before, and Sasuke started to doubt the man had killed the normals. The man turned and started to leave. Sasuke did not waste time and started to jump from the tree. He did not care about the noise he made, but he needed to see the man, whom he suspected must be a black XX hunter. The man stopped and turned to look at Sasuke. Sasuke kept his distance and returned the look. The man must have expected him to say something, but Sasuke was not sure what to say. He had not thought of how he'd go about convincing the rank black XX hunter to take him as his disciple. The man blinked. "Is there something you want?" he asked. "How did you kill those normals? I didn't see you move," Sasuke asked instead of answering. He wanted to know, as he had not seen anything, and aside from that, there was nothing else that proved the man before him was a black XX hunter. "And I should tell you because..." The man drew the word and waited for Sasuke's answer. "Because I want to know. It's not anything complicated. Why don't you figure it out? You look smart." The man turned and started to walk away. Sasuke followed whilst thinking seriously. He had not seen the man move, but he did notice the man gripping that unknown bandaged object strung to his back. He looked at the object as the man walked ahead of him almost silently. Nothing was visible, but from the shape Sasuke guessed it was some kind of weapon. A sword? It was too big to be a sword. Long and wide like a paddle. "I'm guessing it had something to do with your weapon. What is it?" Sasuke asked. "None of your business." "How long are you planning on following me?" the man asked. Sasuke did not reply. It would have helped if the man at least had his hunter badge on him. Sasuke surreptitiously tried to see if it was anywhere on him. The man was wearing what seemed like a black leather overall, but may prove to be brown in daylight. His inner clothing was harder to see, but mostly consist of a shirt and ankle-length trouser pants. He had a ridiculous amount of jewelry on him, a long chain necklace with a silver locket and some kind of strapped leather around his neck. It must be uncomfortable. His ear also appeared to be pierced, with some kind of stud on it. Watching the man, Sasuke started to doubt if he was even a rank black XX hunter. "Your weapon is some kind of sword and you moved pretty fast." Even as he said it, Sasuke knew it was not true. If he had used the sword, or whatever was in there, the bandage should have unraveled. He should have needed some time to arrange it back, but Sasuke had not seen any of that. "Sure. Congratulations. Now will you stop following me and run along?" The voice was bored and did not pay Sasuke any mind. "No, it's not," Sasuke said obstinately. "Perhaps it had nothing to do with your sword. Maybe a hunter's instrument, like the exploding tags. There was also the binding tag and the restrained tag, even the trapping tag, but none of them could do what that man did. Also, the vampires had not exploded, instead they had been cut clean." "What?" The man stopped suddenly and Sasuke almost ran into him. He stopped just a breath away and had to take 2 steps back. He noticed, as he looked up to meet red eyes, that even though the man looked about his age, he was definitely taller, and he realized he probably should stop referring to him as the man because he didn't look like a man, more like a delinquent with an obsession for piercing. His nose was also pierced and so was his brow. This person couldn't possibly be a rank black XX hunter. "Those are hunters' weapons. You think I would use them?" The man, no, the delinquent asked. "Well, yes. Are you not a hunter?" Sasuke replied, trying to act unruffled, but those red eyes were frightening. "Me a hunter?" The man, the delinquent, seemed to find it amusing and chuckled. "Whatever, what is it to you anyway?" "I'm looking for rank black XX hunter. You must be one, or so I thought," Sasuke said. Even if the man was not a hunter, he was strong. Sasuke did not mind very much if he was not a black XX hunter. I'm not black whatever hunter, I'm just Kuro. Ops, I shouldn't have said that. Sasuke wanted to smirk at him. Kuro, huh, good, now that he knew the name he was sure not to forget it. Just Kuro, you seem strong, so I want you to be my master, Sasuke said. Arrogant, aren't you? I refuse, of course. I don't want a brat like you for a disciple. The nose was stuck up in the air caused Sasuke's eyebrow to twitch in irritation. I'm not a brat, you delinquent. I am the same age as you, Sasuke said quickly. Sure you are. What are you, 13? Sasuke wanted to explode but sighed and smiled. You are not going to distract me. I said I wanted you to be my master, not for a very long time, but until you can teach me all I need to know. And I said no. The delinquent turned and started to walk away. Sasuke followed him. Why not? He asked. Did I not already give you my reason? Such a stupid reason. I am a prodigy, okay. I only have to see a technique once to learn it. Then how come you still can't figure out how I killed those normals? Boo-hoo. Damn brat. Sasuke grind his teeth in annoyance. Give me a little time and I will figure it out. He panted out. He noticed that he had started to walk fast and was almost running to keep up with Kuro. The man remained in front of him and seemed like he had not changed pace, but yet Sasuke couldn't keep up. He started to sweat. His forehead and armpit became dampened and dripped sweat into his eyes and clothes. Don't care either. Why are you running? Sasuke called. You are the one running. I'm just walking. He didn't sound winded at all. Sasuke looked to the side and found the bushes and trees passing fast. His legs tightened with each lunge he made. He decided not to talk and simply keep up with Kuro. The man's red hair stood out in the surroundings, so Sasuke was sure he would not lose him even if he fell back. Given up already? Kuro called back. Never, I'm going to make you. Accept to be my master. Sasuke panted out and dragged a hand over his face to wipe his sweat. Stubborn brat. Leave me alone. Kuro yelled and disappeared. Sasuke stopped and looked around for him. The forest had grown tight with trees and bushes. There was hardly any path. Kuro was certain to leave a path no matter how fast he walked. Sasuke found the path that seemed like it was made by legs and ran, following it. After what felt like hours, Sasuke arrived at a stream and could have passed out in joy. He hurried to the stream and drank a mouthful of delicious water. Then he filled his bottle and kept it in his pack, glad for his sense to drag it along with him. He had lost Kuro completely, though he followed the path. In the end he was stranded in a known place. Was this still Ogun? This was his first time in the village and he wasn't sure it was this wide. Exhausted, Sasuke walked slowly following the stream which led him, after hours of stomach-grumbling hunger, to a village. He did not know what it was called, but Sasuke almost ran inside. He would find food and stuff himself, then he would worry about where to get money. Maybe he would do some odd jobs. Sasuke paused on his way in through the gates and looked around. His skin crawled and told him to get out of there, but he walked inside the village looking around. There were houses made of wood scattered in variety around the village, empty of their owners. Sasuke found a horse strapped to a fallen carriage trying to get free. What happened here? He thought out loud. Sasuke rushed over to help the horse but paused and hid behind the fallen carriage when he heard a voice. Kuro, the vampire hunter, a croaky voice was saying. You've really stepped in it, haven't you? Coming here, you must be the dumbest human alive. Sasuke peeped from the corner and saw Kuro standing in a circle of normals. Sasuke gasped at their numbers, then he pulled away, ashamed of his inability to control himself. What if they had heard him? He looked again and found that they had not. They were much too focused on Kuro, who looked indifferent and casual as always. Kuro, the vampire hunter, they had said. Then that must mean he is a hunter after all. Rip him to pieces. This was it. This was the chance to see if Kuro was, indeed, a rank black XX hunter. Even though there were about 30 normals surrounding him and more where Sasuke's eyes could not see, Sasuke knew that a real black XX hunter wouldn't even bat an eyelash. Yet, he could not help but think of the possibility that if Kuro was unable to beat them, their numbers was overwhelming, and judging from that normal who could form speech, an alpha was among them. Normals could not form speech even though they seemed to understand the language, his big brother had told him, but the alpha is capable of speech and is very strong. Sasuke swallowed and pulled the 2 daggers from his backpack, They gleamed black metal. It had been given to him by his big brother to use as a last resort. Unless he had to. Sasuke clenched the weapons with both hands. Only if he had to was he going to show himself. For now, he peeked out again. He would just watch. Itachi looked at the young face of the king as he stuffed sweets after sweets into his mouth with little interest. He was of course a lot more interested than he showed in his new partner, or whatever they had become, but at that moment he was more aware and alert, and therefore, more interested in their surroundings. He looked towards the door of the small dainty restaurant every time the door opened and the small bell hanging on top of it chimed, so much that his eyes were cramping up a little, but he ignored it. The smell of baked goods, sugary and thick, filled his nostrils, and Itachi glanced at the array of sweets, pudding, tarts, cakes and the likes laid out in front of him, or rather the king. It was enough to spill to Itachi's side of the table. He had no idea why they were here in this place that seems to be very popular to the civilians, since the door opened every 10 minutes, and behind him sat a handful of customers. They were on the run with unknown number of nines hot on their tail. It wouldn't take them long to find Itachi and the king even if they were running night and day, but at least they would have had a head start. It made no sense to Itachi why they were sitting casually here in plain sight. Itachi clasped his hand around his gun under the table and looked up at the king, who did not even look at him, too focused on eating the sweets he had ordered. Would it be better to force him out after all? Itachi remembered what had happened in the boat just last night and knew that it would be difficult if not impossible to do so. Itachi tightened his hand around the gun, still tempted to try. They had just left the seashore and were entering the Fire City when the king had let out emphatically that there were places he needed to see. Itachi had of course ignored him. He found the tantrum unimportant to his general goal, that is until the king also let out that he was hungry. Itachi had quickly pressed his gun to the king's back in a discreet way that made sure no one noticed them. He had not wanted the enforcers to come there and question him. Even as a hunter, that would have taken too much time. Time they had none to spare. Yet, if the king had tried to hurt anyone because of his hunger, Itachi was sure he would have tried to stop him no matter what. Despite the tension between them at that moment, the king had somehow managed to convince Itachi that it was not blood he hungered for, but human food. Itachi acted unsurprised, but in reality he was disconcerted by the thought. Vampires eating human food, he'd never thought it was possible. But here they were, him staring while the king ate without reserve. The king did not seem to consider Itachi a threat, in fact, which served to trouble Itachi and remind him constantly of the difference in strength. Delicious. The king had said this a number of times since he started eating, but Itachi could not decide if there was sincerity in the words. The king's cheeks were covered in frosting and food crumbs, his blue eyes shone and he lidded them every time he said those words, but Itachi was still not convinced. He'd never heard of a vampire who could eat human food, not one. He'd studied the information available on vampires in the Hunter's Academy countless times, and it only stated that vampires fed on blood only. He had noticed, of course, after living in Elfheim for years, that the negatives who lived there ate normal human food, except Itachi had never really considered them to be vampires. They were weak and resembled humans in every way. In fact, they were humans in his eyes. But blue-eyed vampires were different, or so he had thought. The king shuffled through the sweets with his fingers and ate whatever he chose without finesse. Itachi would have expected a king to have more manners than that, but this king had never fit the description of a king from the beginning. He was small, thin, his eyes hollow. Itachi had made him strip off his richly clothing, his earrings, rings and bracelets, even the shoe beaded with gems, one of which the king had used to pay for all the things he had bought. Now the king looked even more ordinary, except for his eyes. "What's wrong? Are you not hungry?" The king brought those blue eyes on Itachi's face and Itachi tensed, his shoulders rising before he could control them. Itachi tightened his hand on his gun again. It was no coincidence that it was pointed straight at the king. Every time he looked at those eyes, he always felt as though he was staring at someone else, infinitely wise and strong. His hunter senses, like strands of hair, stood on end and electrified. Itachi glanced at the sundae the waiter had placed in front of him on the king's request, which he had left untouched, now melted and not looking very palatable. Even if he was hungry, there was no way he'd eat something so sweet. "What are we doing here?" Itachi ignored the question and asked. He meant here to mean not just the restaurant but the Fire City as a whole. Although the king's sun-bright hair was covered under a blue baseball hat and he wore gray overalls that were loose around his thin shoulders and fell to his feet, He still stood out like a sore thumb among the numbers of businessmen and women, clerks and youth that came into the restaurant. Some of them even turned their head towards Itachi and the king as they took their seats. Itachi himself was still wearing his black round neck shirt and equally black slacks. His red overalls was on his thigh under the table, covering his gun from view. The king licked his thin fingers with his tongue looking blissful, his eyes closed and a smile on his lips. Why else? He started, "We're here to have fun and fill our stomach with good food." Itachi looked towards the empty pile of cake trays and sundae cup. He wouldn't exactly call them food. He looked at the king once more. "We do not have time for fun," he said, "let's leave immediately." "There are still places I want to see," said the king, pouting. Itachi stayed at the sight of it. He could not exactly pinpoint what was so ridiculous about the sight of it, whether it was the king's flushed puffy cheek and squinted eyes or the very fact that the king was actually resorting to such a display. Did he think Itachi would be moved by the sight? "This is the Fire City, the city of fun. So we must have fun before we leave. Right, Itachi-kun?" the king continued. "I told you not to call me that way," Itachi said. He felt hackles rise on his skin when the king called him like that. Perhaps it was how it made Itachi feel small, or because it seemed a little more intimate somehow. The last thing he needed was any form of intimacy with the king. The bell chimed and Itachi glanced almost automatically towards the door. A couple entered the restaurant and did not look their way. He turned his eyes back to the king. "I do not think you have forgotten, but let me remind you that your people are after us, me in particular. Fun is the last thing I care about," he said. The king somehow managed to reinforce his pout. He squinted even more, pursed his lips even more and puffed his cheek, his face going red with the effort. "But," he drew the word with something Itachi hesitated to call a whine, "the deal was you keep my people from finding me for a week while I do anything I like. Do not add any unnecessary things to our agreement," Itachi said without a blink. "The deal is I keep you from being found for a week. Nothing else." "What's the point? I want to see the circus," the king all but wailed. This startled the customers behind them as they turned to stare at them. Itachi felt the pinprick of their eyes and gritted his teeth. "Don't do that again," he said. The king seemed to realize that he was behaving like a spoiled child for that fact, and leaned back on his chair, food-forgotten hands folded, still pouting. Itachi had no idea why he was still doing that. With a sigh, Itachi said, "Only the circus." He thought it was best to allow this one freedom, then they would leave the city on high speed. He hoped the king could keep up with him. "And the trade fair?" The king's eyes lit up and he leaned forward with the beginning of a smile on his lips. Itachi looked at him for a moment and nodded with a close of his eyes. "And the trade fair for 20 minutes, then we leave. 1 hour each." Itachi opened his eyes and furrowed his eyebrows, looking at the king to see if he was deliberately trying to annoy him. The king looked expectant and his smile had blossomed into a grin. 20 minutes, Itachi said, resisting a scoff. "Each?" asked the king. "Each," Itachi agreed. The king turned his eyes to the side with a thoughtful expression. "He still intends to continue with this?" Itachi raised one eyebrow. "Okay, 20 minutes each in the park for 10, he said. "You are not allowed to add another place," Itachi said. "Only this once, please?" The king clasped his hands together and smiled, looking eager for acceptance. The kings Itachi had heard of would never do something like this. For the first time, Itachi wondered if he had made a mistake. He swept the king's small figure with his eyes briefly and looked at the door as it opened yet again. 10 minutes each, he said, and brought his eyes to see the king smirk momentarily. Then the king raised his hand with a happy cry which drew eyes to their table. Itachi looked at the king with another understanding that still managed to puzzle him. So he wanted to see those 3 places? Itachi did not understand why any of this was important, but he forced himself not to care. It had nothing to do with him. He did not need to know the reason why the king wanted to see these places or why he looked so happy about it. Like a child going out to play for the first time. With a shake of his head, Itachi shook the unnecessary thoughts from him and got to his feet, careful to tuck his gun back into the pocket of his overalls and tucked his hands into the sleeves. From the corner of his eye he saw the king get up as well. "We've got an hour, let's go," Itachi said. The king nodded and furrowed his forehead at something on the table. Itachi looked to see that it was his untouched sundae cup. Did he want that as well? "Are you going to be okay?" the king asked, and Itachi blinked. "You didn't eat anything." Itachi exhaled. "It's none of your concern," he said with finality. The king shouldn't care about him because when the deal is done, and Itachi learned the secret to the blue-eyed vampire's life force, he would wipe them out without fail. Itachi focused his eyes on the door and opened it. He'd already vowed to himself and to his dead clan's member. Nothing would stop him from erasing the blue-eyed vampire species from the face of the earth. Not even the playful, carefree face of the childlike king. They neared the circus and the uninviting sound of cheer reached Itachi's ear, to which he frowned. The bustle of life around the circus did not appeal to him. There were men and women, children and teens walking about, talking like parrots perched on trees. He was caught up in his own discomfort about being around this many people. He noticed a little too slow when the king started to run towards a tent. Itachi did not run but picked up pace enough to catch up with the running king. The king aimed for the tent that Itachi could hear the loud cries of voices filled with excitement and laughter. This caused a sudden wave of repulsion to him. There would be at least 1,000 people in that tent. Itachi would rather stay outside, but the king was already pulling the tent open and walking inside. Itachi did not trust that the king would not try to run. He was sure that the king wanted to. Why would the king stay with Itachi when he could survive out here by himself? Itachi followed him and held a hand to his nose at the smell of sweat and what he thought was urine mixed with something foul. His eyes settled on the crowd seated in a tight space watching what appeared to be a stage act. He looked for the blue baseball hat and found it walking back towards him on the head of the king. Itachi was prepared to stand by the entrance, hands folded. He would blend with the shadow and watch the king the entire time, but the king grabbed his hand out of the blue. "Come on, Itachi-kun. There is space at the front." Without his consent, the king started to pull him down the crooked steps. Itachi pulled his hand from the king and instead of making a scene, although he doubted if the crowd would pay them any attention, he followed complacently behind the king. They seated on the fourth row, much to Itachi's annoyance. The light from the stage shone on his eyes, making it almost impossible for him to watch the crowd. Even though Itachi trusted his senses to tell him when the nines were closer, he also wanted to be able to find the best possible escape route. The king clapped and cheered beside him, apparently unconcerned about any of it. Itachi discreetly took a gander at him and found the blue eyes focused solely on the stage master. A man wearing an hideous mask that looked like the imagined face of a red demon, beastly looking with sharp teeth, stood on stage talking. Itachi tuned out most of what was said but knew when the stage master asked for a volunteer for his next act. The loud clamor of the crowd vibrated the ground under Itachi's feet. It seems everyone wanted to be chosen. On the stage, two girls dressed scantily in white and purple wearing cat ears stood by a clock wheel and smiled at the audience. The crowd fell silent. He could only hear their breathing. Itachi started and dropped his folded hands when the light shone on the person beside him. "Yes!" cried the king and got to his feet. Itachi had been aware of the king crying out with the crowd, but he had not paid him any attention. He reached out a hand to grab the king and keep him there. If the king was on stage, it would be easy for him to slip away using some kind of distraction. Itachi needed him by his side where he could watch him and at the same time make escape easier for them both. He was stymied by the look on the king's face. The king's eyes danced like sapphire jewels. Itachi would have described them as pretty to himself and no one else, his smile wide and open. Innocent. Itachi had stayed stunned too long, and by the time he blinked, the king was already jumping high over the crowd and on the stage. "Wow, what a very enthusiastic kid," the stage master praised. "What's your name, son?" he asked. "Ikumi," declared the king with his grin spreading wide. "Ha ha, Ikumi-kun. You sound very excited. Are you afraid? Don't be, because these pretty Oni-shans will be looking after you, okay?" Ikumi. Itachi did not feel that the name fitted. Something about it seemed off to him, but it did not matter. Names did not matter to Itachi, especially not the king's. The king turned to look at the girls who cheerfully guided him to the wheel. The crowd still sounded like chickens squawking to Itachi's ears, but his attention was focused almost fully on the king. He watched them strap the king upside down to the wheel. The stage master held up 3 daggers the size of Itachi's hand and showed it to the audience. He threw the dagger one after the other at the king, missing him by a few inches above his head and near his side. Itachi could see the skill that the man possessed in throwing those daggers from so far away, although he said things like, "Ops, that was dangerous," and, "Ow, so close," as if he had almost touched the king by mistake, and the crowd hushed even more, perhaps holding their breath. The next dagger went straight into the king's stomach, or so it seemed. The crowd screamed, loud enough that Itachi had to duck his head on reflex. To the untrained eye, it seemed as though the dagger pierced through the king's stomach and disappeared inside his body, but Itachi had seen the quick catch one of the girls had made. So fast was it that it would have been hard to follow. Itachi looked at the girl. She had a slight figure, her hair in two buns. It seemed this circus was not as simple as it looks. Itachi's senses went haywire. A scream drowned out the loud voices of the crowd and others followed in succession. Blood. The voice shook. With fear Itachi suspected already on his feet. He knew immediately. His senses pinpointed 3 locations in the crowd. Like arrows they highlighted black coats. Vampire. The crowd broke loose. Itachi jumped on top of a vacated chair as men and women took to their heels screaming. The sound tore the cramped space and anyone outside would be horrified at it. Itachi backflipped into the air, his eyes focused on the stage where the king should be. He landed on his feet, the sound of his shoe hitting the wood floor drowned out by screams and shouts. He looked unsurprised at the empty wheel. He had known this already, now all he had to do was make sure the king would not get far. To his side a woman screamed. Itachi turned his head and saw the black hair of a man on her shoulder. No, not a man. A vampire. Itachi blew past the woman and the vampire with the echo of his gunshot. That did not stop the crowd from pushing over each other to get to the door. Itachi leapt into the air and his shots sounded resolutely in the air. The dusts of dead vampires floated after him and using the head of a stranger, Itachi propelled his body out of the narrow flap of the tent. He landed on one knee, eyes darted left and right looking for that blue baseball hat. He could not find it. Itachi stood straight and walked as his hunter senses guided. Vampires in broad daylight. This was not unheard of, but it was unusual. Something must have driven them out of hiding. Shadowed faces with blue eyes flashed behind Itachi's eyes and he quickened his pace. Itachi walked past a blind alley and stopped. His hunter senses tingled. Itachi drew his gun from his pocket as he walked with certain steps into the alley. The stale foul stench of rubbish greeted him. Woods lay resting on the walls and rubbish tins beside them, heaped to the brim till spilling. Then he saw her. The body of a girl, probably 5-year-old. She lay on the ground, the shoulder of her dress torn and a gaping hole on her neck bleeding still and forming a pool of blood around her. She was not dead. Yet. Itachi felt that the person he used to be would have paused at the sight. He raised his gun to the girl's head. The person he was would have felt something, but the person standing there staring at that child felt nothing. It should have terrified him, but Itachi met the thought with resignation. He had already decided that no vampire should be spared. He would kill all of them. Not even a child vampire will escape him. Itachi pulled the trigger. The shot rang loud and clear and deafening, but she was still alive. Itachi blinked at the blue eyes looking up at him. In front of him, kneeling in front of the girl, his back to her, was the king he had been looking for. His blue eyes had a bright light in them, steady and unblinking. Itachi blinked again when blood slowly trailed down the front of the king's face, past his nose going to his lips. The king did not reach up to clean the blood but continued staring. "What are you doing?" Itachi was the one to break the silence, immensely confused. He had not sensed the king but only felt the cool wind brush his skin before the king appeared as he is. "You can't kill her like that," the king said. "What?" Itachi furrowed his brows. "You can't kill her," the king repeated. Itachi had no idea why the king was demanding something so unusual but did not care, could not care. "She is a vampire," he said to explain everything. "And you are a hunter, I know, but it is not her fault that she became a vampire," the king said. "No, it is yours," Itachi thought. "That does not matter," he said and moved his gun in position to fire at the girl again. The king grabbed his gun and Itachi widened his eyes at the hand. He looked up to see the king's eyes, blue and steady with what Itachi could tell was anger. He could not fathom what the king was angry about, that he held on to Itachi's hunter weapon without flinching. Itachi could hear the sizzling sound and smell the burning flesh, yet, the king did not move his hand. Itachi gritted his teeth when he tried to pull his gun away and the king held it there by force. It became a tug of war with the king's strength surpassing his. "You can't just decide that on your own," said the king as he sent Itachi's gun flying out of his hand. Itachi widened his eyes, knowing it was possible, that the king was stronger than he looks, than Itachi, was different from actually experiencing it. "The girl is too young to be killed like that," the king continued. If you try to, then I will have to stop you. Itachi's heart beat rapidly in his chest, but it was not of fear but immense anger. The king had no idea what he was saying. If Itachi left that girl to live, she would become a vampire. To Itachi, that was worse than death. Death was mercy. Yes, and this king is just trying to create more monsters like the Nines. The world didn't need that. Itachi didn't need that. Itachi pulled out his other gun and held it to the king's head. Get out of the way, he demanded. The king's eyes settled and he remained where he was, even though Itachi moved his gun to face the girl. The king met his eyes straight on, unwavering, unflinching. Itachi fired. Twice. His shot rang and the king's body flew with force to the wall behind the girl. The wall cracked and looked about to cave in. Itachi took 2 breaths and cooled his anger. He walked towards his gun and picked it up. What are you going to do about her? He asked. The king sat up with a groan, his face covered in blood. He grinned. Send her to my home, he said. And send your people straight for us? Itachi frowned. The king crawled towards the girl and raised her mouth to his wrist. Itachi looked away when her small fang pierced the skin of the king's wrist. No, said the king, I will make sure she avoids them. Itachi turned and the girl opened blue eyes and stared at the king with something close to awe. Go to Elfheim. Tell them the king sent you. The king instructed her as though he expected her to do just that. Avoid everyone on your way. The girl nodded and got her feet shakily, then she started to climb the wall like a spider. Itachi watched her disappear, feeling like something was crawling under his skin. What did you do to her? He asked. Did you turn her into a noble, a nine? He had to ask. The king got to his feet and laughed, scratching his head. Something like that, he said. More blood rolled down his face and into his shirt. Itachi picked up a dirty old rag and handed it to him without a word and not looking at him. Ah, Itachi-kun, just like I suspected. You have a warm side to you after all. The king said. Itachi could tell he was smiling. Oh well, let him think what he wants. Itachi did not care. The end. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next part.